Chapter 85. The old man took a moment to respond. He slowly lifted the quilt, moved to the bedside, and looked directly at the archbishop. "If you were locked up in this damn place, would you still be able to eat?" he said. His voice was muffled, as if his throat was blocked by something. "Half a year. I've been trapped here for half a year without any news. What happened to my son? What about my daughter?" Maine noticed that the walls were full of scratches, which seemed to have been made by nails. Did the other party use this method to count the days? He moved a stool and sat down facing the king. "Do you have to ask these unpleasant things?" The other party was silent for a long time. "I'm no longer useful. Are you here to send me on my way?" "I'm just a dying man. Why would I care about unpleasant things? Before I die, I just want to know their situation." By the time he finished his last sentence, Wimbledon's voice was already close to a low roar. In the end, he couldn't stand it anymore. Maine thought, no matter what, as a king, his spirit and demeanor were enough. After being replaced by the devout, on the way to Hermes, he tried many times to escape. Imprisoned at this time, he did not fall into madness, but instead tried to negotiate in exchange for freedom. There was no abuse, no hysterical roar, which was rare in the mechanical prison. If it wasn't for the fact that the plan could not be changed, he really didn't want to waste such a person on internal conspiracies. "Perhaps I came in person with the idea of informing him of the current situation," the archbishop thought. "Otherwise, with just a command, the army of judges would end his life for me." "Your eldest son, Gerald Wimbledon, is dead," Maine slowly said. "He was sentenced to be beheaded by your second son, Timothy Wimbledon, on the charge of rebellion against the king. Your third daughter, Garcia Wimbledon, became independent in the Southern Territory and called herself the Queen of Clearwater, so a war with Timothy was inevitable. As for your fourth son and fifth daughter, we didn't get much news. Probably they are still alive." "What are you talking about? Rebellion? Independence? What did you do?" "Order to fight for the throne," he said, enunciating each word. "Assign your children to different places, and declare that whoever governs his territory the best will be the next king." Wimbledon closed his eyes in pain. After a long time, he whispered, "Why? You took advantage of the day of prayer to take me into a cubicle and strip me of my clothes, and the god's stone of retaliation. You used a witch to replace me with someone else. You could have slowly taken over this country and built churches in every town. Why did they issue such a thing as the royal decree for the selection of crown prince? I couldn't possibly." Speaking of the agitated part, Wimbledon bent his body and coughed violently. "There's no way I'm going to issue an order that's going to cause kids to kill each other, right?" Maine finished for the king in his heart. "Perhaps you won't, but your children may not necessarily do as you wish. When they grow up, they will have their own ideas. For example, your third daughter, Garcia, as early as 5 years ago, she obtained the port of Clearwater. Even if there is no order to fight for the throne, or if you wait until you die of natural causes, will she just watch Gerald ascend the throne and remain indifferent? The most important thing is, we don't have time to plan slowly. You should have noticed that a witch's ability is not permanent. Damn it, what good will it do the church if they fight each other? The church will fall into a sea of fire, the believers will also lose their lives in the war, the kingdom will be in chaos." At this point, Wimbledon suddenly froze and looked up in disbelief. "Do you want to?" A more violent cough interrupted the king's words. After recovering with great difficulty, his voice became as thin as a gossamer, as if the coughing had consumed all of his energy. "Want to destroy the royal family?" "Exactly, but it would be more accurate to say that it is the royal power." Maine couldn't help but praise in his heart, what a sharp judgment. After staying in this dark dungeon for almost half a year, the fact that he didn't lose his mind could already be counted as having a firm will. Over the years, the number of people who can still think can be counted on one hand. The royal power will hinder the development of the church. No matter how weak it is, it will always grow slowly like a seedling. Only by uprooting it can the church truly obtain this kingdom. Wimbledon's expression suddenly became a lot older. Perhaps it was only his appearance before, but now even his spirit had declined, and the light in his eyes had become dim. Grey Castle is the largest kingdom in the mainland with a large number of soldiers, and a direct war against the church is disadvantageous. We have been planning for this for a long time. Your kingdom is bound to lose a lot of soldiers and mercenaries in the civil war. As long as it continues for 2 or 3 years, our army of judges will be able to easily take over the whole territory of Grey Castle. You don't have to be too sad. You are not the only king of a kingdom. The other 3 kingdoms are also the same. In the future, the mainland will no longer be divided into 4 kingdoms: the Kingdom of Dawn, the Kingdom of Wolfheart, the Kingdom of Everwinter, and Grey Castle will all disappear. In this vast land, there will only be one regime, and that is the church. Wimbledon was silent. This man who had seized the throne from his brother by force now seemed to have lost his vitality. Even Maine felt a trace of pity, but he didn't have the slightest regret in his heart. The church also paid a lot for this. A large number of outstanding believers were willing to be pawns, and threw themselves into this layout without a care for their own safety. The man who played the role of Wimbledon III was a devout chief judge in the army of judges. He had a firm belief and absolute loyalty to the church, and was originally going to accept the transformation ceremony of the God's punishment army. However, in order to fulfill his mission, he was replaced by a witch with the appearance of the king, and died without any honor in the king's bedroom in Grey Castle. He could have carved his name on the monument in the Church of Hermes, but now, the church could only bury his name forever. Maine thought that Wimbledon would not speak again, so he took out a small porcelain bottle from his pocket and was about to let him drink it, but he asked, "Curse, I curse you. I will wait for you in the depths of hell." His voice was getting weaker and weaker, and Maine had to concentrate to hear him clearly. Unfortunately, there is no hell in this world. Even if there is, it doesn't belong to us. And everything we do is to continue. Only by unifying the 4 kingdoms can the church gather the greatest power to defeat the real enemy, otherwise. The bishop stopped here. He saw that Wimbledon's hand had already fallen, his head tilted to one side, and his chest had completely stopped moving. This is the ending of a king, but it is a new beginning for us, he thought. Chapter 86. Leaf didn't know how she had survived these days. It took her nearly half a month to return to the camp in the impassable mountain range from the barbarian land. In order to avoid the demonic beasts, she carefully hid in the thick trunk, and after confirming that there were no demonic beasts nearby, she went to the next place where she could hide. Although she was burning with anxiety, she had no other choice. Once she was discovered by the hybrid demonic beasts, she wouldn't be able to escape with her own strength. More than 10 sisters fell under the demon's slaughter, and the other sisters weren't good at fighting. When the Iron Hand demon jumped into the crowd and wantonly slaughtered, they scattered in all directions. But in the end, how many of them could return to the camp alive? Leaf had no idea. She didn't even dare to think about this terrible problem. Walking and hiding along the way consumed a lot of magic power. She could only walk a little more than 10 miles a day, and she also had to prepare the magic needed for the night. After eating up her dry food, she turned some wild fruits into food to quench her hunger and thirst. The Witch Cooperation Association's emblem had long lost its ability to keep warm, so she could only wrap herself in tree bark. Thinking of Sino, who died here before she was even a child, Leaf's tears couldn't stop falling. What's worse, on the 4th night, she faced the demon's bite in the trunk. A series of blows made her almost forget about it. A tearing pain suddenly bloomed from her chest and quickly spread to her whole body. For a moment, she almost lost consciousness. Biting her tongue until her mouth was full of blood, she gathered her spirit to resist the pain. Under the torture of the demon's bite, Leaf also thought of giving up, but thinking of the more than 20 sisters who might have survived, or were waiting for her return at the camp, or were seriously injured and needed her treatment and help, she clenched her teeth and persevered. Fortunately, the demon's bite didn't last long. When she broke free from the pain, her whole body was covered with cracks, and the inside of the trunk was wet with blood. In order to avoid attracting the demonic beasts with the smell of blood, she had to endure the pain, take off her clothes, and go to another big tree. At the same time, she let the bare branches grow green leaves, and the green leaves were made into clothes that could protect her from the cold. Under the guidance of magic, The branches became her needles, and the veins of the leaves were her threads. Along the way, she did not eat any cooked food or drink any hot water. After entering the impassable mountain range, even though she added 2 more layers of green leaves to her clothes and wrapped her hands and feet tightly, the rapidly falling temperature and the snow that covered her ankles still caused her toes to freeze. Just like that, she walked and stopped, dragging her numb feet, and finally returned to the camp. Seeing the familiar figures of her sisters, Leaf fell to the ground. When she woke up, it was already 2 days later. The long period of hypothermia had caused serious damage to her feet. Even herbal medicine could not stop the expanding gangrene. As a last resort, the sisters amputated 2 damaged toes of her left and right feet. Leaf didn't care too much. It was good enough that she survived. Compared to her sisters who would never come back, she was lucky enough. However, when he saw the white bandages wrapped around the arms of the people who were still alive, a great sorrow surged from the bottom of his heart. Of the 42 sisters who had set out, only 6 remained. After everyone comforted Leaf, Scroll, who was the oldest among them, told her about their experiences. While they were fighting with the devil, the non-combat witches took the opportunity to escape in the direction of the camp. That night, they encountered demonic beasts, a group of wild boars. Unable to resist, they had to flee in all directions. The group that had been hunted by the demonic beasts was obviously doomed, but they didn't have time to worry about it. The next morning, they were once again targeted by a wolf hybrid. This time, only 8 people escaped. Fortunately, after entering the impassable mountain range, the demonic beasts did not follow them. A few days after returning to the camp, the 2 sisters showed symptoms of magic bite. Perhaps it was because the Witch Cooperation Association had suffered too much this time, and the future was bleak. The 2 of them were unable to survive the demonic bite. But the combat witches did not return. Just when everyone thought that they had died in the hands of the devil, Leaf unexpectedly came back. So, what about the others? Red Pepper, Windchaser, and Mentor, how are they? Leaf shook her head. I'm the only one who survived. Is that so? Scroll replied softly. It was obvious that she had expected this answer. Then you should rest well. She hesitated. Leaf. What? When you were in a coma, we discussed it. If Kara does not come back, we hope that you can take over the position of mentor. Yi froze for a moment, then closed his eyes. Yes, the Witch Cooperation Association had suffered such a painful blow. If they did not elect a new leader, I'm afraid that they would immediately collapse. But the purpose of the Witch Cooperation Association was to find the Holy Mountain, to obtain freedom and a place of rest. Now the search for the Holy Mountain had disappeared. No, the Holy Mountain itself was a fraud. It did not exist in the impassable mountain range, nor did it exist in the barbarian land. So, was there any need for the Witch Cooperation Association to exist? Her heart was in a mess. Even if she did not look at them, she could feel the expectant eyes of her sisters. They needed someone to stand up and lead the confused people forward. "You should go find Nightingale," after a long silence, Leaf said. "What, find her? Do you mean go to Border Town? What if she lied to us? Vendi is also there. Maybe she is already dead." The sisters began to talk at once. Scroll clapped her hands to calm everyone down, and then asked Leaf, "What if what Nightingale said is also a fraud?" "You can wait in a safe place outside the town." She opened her eyes. "First let me find out the situation. If what she said is a lie, I will take over the position of mentor. I die in the town, Scroll, you will lead the sisters to continue." "But Leaf reluctantly smiled, "I know that your ability is not suitable for fighting and is not very helpful for the daily operation of the camp. But now I understand that the strength of a person's ability has nothing to do with the suitability of being a mentor. A mentor is a guide, not the strongest person. Unfortunately, I realized this too late. If the mentor of the Witch Cooperation Association was the patient and meticulous Vendi, would the outcome be completely different? You and Vendi are the first to join the Witch Cooperation Association, and you are also the elder of the sisters. From the east of the kingdom, you accompanied us to the impassable mountain range. You are experienced and cautious, everyone can see it. No one is more suitable than you to be the mentor of the sisters. Scroll was silent for a moment. What if what Nightingale said is true? Chapter 87. Ready dash. Vanner forcefully thrust the spear in his hand, and then his hands shook violently. The spear shaft made a cracking sound. A wolf was standing on the spearhead. Its fur was fluffy, and its blood-red eyes were as big as copper bells. It opened its mouth, revealing 2 rows of sharp teeth, the largest of which was as big as his thumb. It was the first time for him to be so close to a demonic beast. The wolf waved its claws in the air, and the snowflakes even splashed on his face. Vanner's mind went blank. He subconsciously clenched the spear shaft and continued to push forward according to the instinct accumulated in his training. One breath seemed to be extremely long. He saw that the spear shaft was bent to the limit, and the spearhead was deeply inserted into the belly of the demonic beast. He even thought that the next moment, the sharp claws would tear his cheeks. With a crack, the spear shaft could not bear the impact of the wolf and finally broke into 2. It was also this crisp sound that made the flow of time return to normal. The beast fell down just as it came. Its claws fell on the wall, scraping a series of debris, and along with the half of the spear shaft, it fell heavily to the ground along the wall. Flintlock team, loading complete. Free shooting. Vanner immediately stretched out 2 barrels. He quickly took half a step back and raised his head to avoid the gunpowder fragments and gas rushing into his eyes. As for his ears, he had no time to care about them. The flintlock quickly finished firing. Vanner approached the wall again and found that a group of various demonic beasts had fallen under the wall. Someone beside him poked him. He turned his head and saw his roommate grinning proudly at him. He had only been using a gun for a little more than a week. What was there to be proud of? Vanner stared back at him and turned his eyes back to the battlefield. When His Highness artillery team comes in handy, you will realize that the iron pipe in your hand is just a crutch. Gunner, your gun, take it. Cat's Claw handed over a new wooden gun. Are these demonic beasts crazy? It's been 4 or 5 hours, right? They are crazy. Vanner set up the gun and waited for the enemy's next wave of attack. What time is it now? It's almost noon. Cat's Claw sighed and quickly looked around while the hunters were not paying attention. Where's Jop? Where's Rodney, brother? Don't look away. Do you want to be cut open by the wolf? Vanner said grumpily. They were assigned to other sections of the city wall, maybe in Group 3 or Group 4. By the way, why are you in Group 1? I'm a substitute. He chuckled. I'll go wherever there's a need. An uncle was injured just now, and it's my turn to replace. Ready? The hunter observer's voice rang out, interrupting Cat's Claw. Vanner saw more than 10 demonic beasts rapidly approaching. Now he could quickly distinguish the different types of demonic beasts. There were only 2 wolves in this wave, and the rest were wild boars, foxes, and a bear. They were not a threat to the city wall. Stab. Even so, he still obeyed the command and stabbed with his spear together with his teammates. Sure enough, the spearhead was empty this time. He retracted his spear and saw that the wolf had been shot down by the other members of Team 1. When the rest of the slower demonic beasts had gathered at the foot of the city wall, the flintlock team squeezed to his side and fired freely. This fixed action had been repeated from dawn until now. When the horn was first blown, most of the people were still asleep. Vanner yawned. This time, the demonic beast's attack was fiercer than before. Usually, there would only be 1 or 2 waves of attacks, but now it was still continuing. The corpses of the demonic beasts under the city wall were almost piled up. Halfway through, he had been replaced by the 2nd militia team. After eating something and resting for a while, he went back to the city wall again. But unexpectedly, Vanner found that he was calmer than he had imagined. When he heard the command to stab, he put away his spear and left the rest to the flintlock team. At first, it seemed that there were some inexplicable regulations and movement requirements, but now they all came in handy and incredibly effective. The others were similar to him. Although they held the spear with both hands and looked quite serious, and some substitutes seemed very nervous, everyone stood straight and no one took a step back. But Vanner knew that their greatest confidence did not come from the daily practice, but from His Highness. Only after the flintlock team started shooting, Vanner secretly glanced at the watchtower in the middle of the city wall. That was where His Highness stood. From the moment the horn sounded, His Highness had arrived at the city wall and stood on the same line of defense as everyone else. Until now, he had not rested. Even when Vanner was rotated to eat, His Highness still stayed at the top of the watchtower, and his breakfast was personally sent by the chief knight. Thinking back, every year during the months of demons, the last lord would leave by ship. Next would be the nobles, and finally the civilians. If they had money, they could pay a few silver royals and leave by ship. If they had no money, they could only walk to Longsong's stronghold on their own feet. Thinking of this, Vanner felt full of strength. Yes, they were the troops of Prince Greycastle, and were completely different from the patrols in Border Town. Relying on their armors and weapons, they often ran amok in the old and new areas, and even extorted foreign merchants. In Vanner's view, except for the two captains of the patrols, the others were no different from hooligans. The militia was a strong team, and under the leadership of His Royal Highness, they were even able to block the demonic beasts outside of Border Town, never allowing them to take a single step forward. In the past, only Longsong's stronghold could do this. Look at Fishball, the famous coward in the old area, who was often ridiculed. After joining the second militia team, he was now able to hold a spear well. And then there was Fermi, who was huge, but always slow, and people in the old area liked to tease him. Now, his spear movements were fast and ruthless, and he was much more adept than most people. Vanner knew that after others finished their training he would practice 100 more shots, because His Highness had told him, the more inflexible a bird is, the sooner it can fly, so that it can catch up with others and eventually surpass them. Obviously, at the beginning it was only for the 2 eggs, but now he felt lucky that he had joined the militia. Every day there was a slight change, and every day he was better than yesterday. Vanner believed that it was not only him, everyone felt this. He did not know how to describe his mood. Perhaps, it could be summarized as what His Highness often said during training: they were a team that was different from the times. Woo, woo dash, 2 short horn sounds made Vanner excited. This was an early warning of the appearance of a hybrid demonic beast. He looked into the distance and saw a hybrid with a lion's head and wings, very similar to the one that broke into the city last time. This is the second one we met today, he thought, but this time it was different. In addition to the flintlock team, they had other helpers. Chapter 88. Don't be so anxious, it hasn't come yet. Roland looked at the eager Lightning and sighed. Only God knew that she was so interested in challenging the demonic beasts. She was obviously not the type that was suitable for fighting, but she didn't have any fear of the demonic beasts. Follow the way you dealt with the first one. Don't try to be brave. You just need to lure the demonic beast and focus its attention on you. Pay attention to maintain a high altitude. Although it can't fly, it's still quite threatening when it jumps. I know, Lightning said confidently. When the first one came, I already knew its strength. Don't worry, it can't even touch the corner of my clothes. During the conversation, the hybrid demonic beast had already approached the city wall, crossed an obstacle area, and jumped towards the unguarded area, flipping over the wall. But this time, no militia members paid attention to it. They still stayed in their defensive area, waiting for the next assassination order from the Hunter Observer. So, the special operation against the hybrid demonic beast now begins, Roland said in a deep voice. Lightning, who had already flown out, stopped and looked back at Roland. What's wrong? What you said? Lightning thought for a moment, then shook her head. It's a bit strange. Forget it, I'm leaving. Looking at the little girl's quickly disappearing figure, Roland smiled awkwardly and asked Anna and Nightingale behind him, Do you also think it's strange? Both of them nodded. Well, it seems that even in a different world, the lines of a Chunibyu are still Chunibyu. Then you also go, pay attention to your safety. Your Highness, you too. Nightingale bowed, then took Anna's hand and entered the fog. Roland put his hands behind his back and stood against the wind, trying to act like a big boss. He knew that many people would secretly look back at him during the battle, so even though his feet were numb, he still stood at the highest point of the city wall, so that everyone could see that the prince was with them at any time. Since he couldn't personally participate in the battle, he could at least use this way to motivate people. This time, the demonic beast's attack had exceeded the intensity of any previous attack. According to Iron Axe, in the previous years during the months of the demons, only 1 or 2 demonic hybrids would appear, but this year, Border Town had already encountered 4 demonic hybrids. The demonic beasts continued to emerge from the concealing forest in batches of dozens of beasts, constantly rushing towards the city wall. Fortunately, in the past month, the production of flintlocks had increased greatly. Right now, a team of 100 flintlocks had been fully equipped. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to maintain such an efficient killing speed. If it was a crossbow, it would be difficult to load it. In a protracted battle, the advantage of a firearm in consuming little stamina would become increasingly obvious. Of course, the rapid increase in the consumption of gunpowder was enough to give Roland a headache. He was already considering dismantling the 20 or so bags of explosives in the warehouse, retrieving the gunpowder for the firearm squad. On the other side, lightning had already flown over the head of the hybrid demonic beast. She took a stone from her pocket and threw it at the demonic beast. The stone accurately fell on its head. This sudden attack made it fiercely retreat, only to discover that the attack had come from the air. Lightning provocatively lowered her altitude and passed in front of it, flying close to the ground towards the center of the town. Although the hybrid demonic beast had a certain ability to think, the little girl in front of it was obviously not a threat. It immediately swooped down, spread its wings, and with a few leaps, glided nearly 100 meters. Lightning immediately pulled herself up, turned around in the air, bypassed several bungalows, and turned into another street. In this way, after several turns, she lured the demonic beast to the central square of the town, which was also the place where she and Nightingale had agreed to attack. Because the hybrid demonic beast had a very sensitive sense of smell, it could even detect Nightingale in the fog. Therefore, before Nightingale and Anna launched their attack, Roland had to try to distract the demonic beast as much as possible. But Lightning had done it perfectly. The hybrid was now obviously in a rage, and its increasingly manic bestial nature had covered up what little reason it had. It opened its mouth wide and jumped several times into the air, but Lightning, who did not have any weight on her body, was far more flexible than the demonic beast. She teased the hybrid up and down, making every time it jumped up, it would fail. Nightingale had also arrived at the square from another direction. Unlike Lightning, after entering the fog, she completely ignored the houses and fences on the road and moved forward in a straight line. The distance of Anna's flame was only 10 steps, 5 meters, so she had to approach the demonic beast from behind to reduce the possibility of being discovered by the demonic beast. There were a lot of mistakes when dealing with the first hybrid, but now Nightingale was completely familiar with Anna's attack style. When she was only 30 steps away from the demonic beast, she raised her speed to the limit. The ground seemed to be shortened in an instant, and she almost crossed the remaining distance in 1 step. When Anna came back to her senses, the monster's tail was almost touching her face. "Now!" Nightingale shouted. The black and white world around Anna receded like the tide, and in the blink of an eye, she returned to the familiar town square. The green flame quietly appeared on her fingertips, and then expanded into a huge flame cage, covering the demonic beast. Nightingale quickly retreated. The rolling heat wave hitting her face had already made her feel a burning pain. In the heat that could melt steel, the demonic beast didn't even have the time to struggle, and turned into a fireball, crashing to the ground. "It seems that they have solved it," said Vendi, who replaced Nightingale as the temporary guard, when she saw the rising green flame in the distance, curled her lips and said, "It seems that I didn't play any role. If possible, I hope that you don't have to go to the battlefield," said Roland, still standing with his hands behind his back, pretending to be relaxed. Even so, he knew that today, if there were no witches to join the defense line to assist in the battle, in the face of the hybrid demonic beast that could fly over the city wall, the militia would inevitably be in chaos. Even Nana had come to the city wall, and under the protection of Baron Sir, she quickly treated the wounded soldiers. This was the first time that Roland had revealed the power of the witches in front of all the militia members, and the result made him very happy. In the militia, Nana, who was known as the Angel of Healing, had obviously raised the reputation of the witches to a new height. After Anna and Nightingale joined hands to kill the first hybrid on the city wall, the crowd burst into cheers. Of course, he knew that it was impossible for everyone to not care about this, and such a situation was very rare. After the militia had a preliminary consensus, his next plan would be much easier to implement. Suddenly, the gunshots on the city wall became sparse, and Roland noticed that the demonic beasts began to withdraw from the city wall. They actually retreated? He couldn't believe his eyes. At this moment, a ray of light pierced through the thick clouds in the sky and sprinkled onto the ground, followed by a second ray, a third ray. Very soon, the dusky sky was riddled with holes by the millions of rays of light. All the rays of light fused into one, becoming dazzling and indescribable. The earth suddenly brightened. When the sun rises again, it will be the end of the months of demons. There was a brief silence on the city wall, and then a wave of cheers swept through the border defense line. Gradually, the townspeople also came out of their houses and shouted. They cheered for the long-lost sunshine, for their safe winter, and for their prince. All the voices finally converged into a torrent, resounding throughout Border Town. Chapter 89. This year's Border Town was very different from the previous years. In previous years, after the end of the months of the demons, they had to stay in the slums of Longsong Stronghold for another month, waiting for the snow to completely melt before they could embark on their journey home. But when they returned to the town, they saw that it was mostly a mess. The houses that had not been taken care of for several months were dilapidated, some of the less sturdy wooden houses had long been crushed by the heavy snow, and some of the townspeople were even hiding from the demonic beasts. Cabinets and tables were bitten to pieces, and they even dragged rags of grass to fill the corners, apparently using this place as a shelter from the wind and snow as their own nest. They often spent a week repairing the houses and replacing the soaked and moldy furniture. As for the lingering smell of decay, the residents here were already used to it. But this year, Border Town could be said to be brand new. The snow was quickly swept away, and the prince's colorful paper flags were hung in front of the houses. Looking from afar, the monotonous and dilapidated town had become a riot of colors, all kinds of flags mixed together, like a sea of flowers. Everyone rushed to spread the news that on the first day after the end of the months of the demons, His Highness would hold a grand celebration ball in the square. Anyone could go. Not only did they not need to pay money, but they also heard that there would be free food. What was a ball? It was a social occasion that only the upper nobles could attend. Everyone had only heard about it from the well-informed merchants in the big cities, but even they could not participate in it. According to the merchants, it was not an event that could be invited just because you had money. His Highness actually allowed everyone to attend? Your Highness, isn't it not good for you to do this? Chief Knight dissuaded, there is neither a band nor a lead dancer here who will control the rhythm of the ball. Besides, in such a remote place, even the nobles might not necessarily know how to dance. Your subjects will only ruin everything. Carter had only been to one ball in King's City, which was held by a marquis to celebrate his daughter's birthday. Elegant string music and impassioned drumbeats intertwined. The ladies danced to the melodious music, while the men showed their fast and powerful dance steps after the drumbeat sounded. They either spun or kicked, combining their movements with the drumbeats. During the break, the attendants shuttled through the crowd with drinks and snacks. The men were all looking for the women they liked, and when the last piece of music was played, they summoned their courage and went up to invite her. After the ball was over, the winner would have a romantic night. Carter sighed. Although he didn't manage to date the girl he liked when he was young, the elegant and romantic atmosphere still made him reminisce. Replacing the distinguished nobles with this bunch of villagers who deal with rocks and beasts every day? God, he could not imagine such a scene. Lead dancer? Roland ordered the militia to remove all the stone sculptures and gallows in the square. Iron Axe and the militia are the ones. That Sand Nation? Carter was stunned. As the captain of the Flintlock team, Iron Axe's performance during the months of the demons had finally won the recognition of the Chief Knight, and he no longer mentioned the title of alien. But in the end, he was still a Majin. How could he know the etiquette of the mainland kingdom? Roland smiled mysteriously. Because I'm not going to hold a normal ball, you'll know when the time comes. There wasn't much preparation work to be done. The main thing was to remove the obstacles in the square and build a pile of firewood in the center. Next to the pile of firewood was a brick table for barbecuing. That's right, this was the celebratory ball that Roland had thought of, a combination of a bonfire party and a barbecue in the wild. How to increase the people's sense of identity with their place of residence had always been a problem that the prince had seriously considered. Nationalism and nationalism were too profound for these uneducated villagers who had worked for the Lord all their lives. Only their wealth and loved ones were worth caring about. The more backward a civilization was, the more short-sighted it would be. This was the law of civilization development. Civilization will eventually become as big as its thoughts. Roland deeply believed in this. But this didn't mean that spiritual construction could be ignored. The victory celebration was one of the methods he had figured out. In fact, it was difficult to understand why the world didn't have any celebration after the months of the demons. The once-a-year invasion of the demonic beasts was like a natural disaster. Defeating such evil spirits was naturally worthy of being written in a book. So he decided to name the first day after the end of the months of the demons as Victory Day. All the territories that belonged to him would not only have a public holiday, but also hold a variety of celebration activities. As long as it lasted for 3 or 4 years, it would become a tradition that would be passed down in the territory. And the people would gradually feel that they were different from the people under the rule of other lords. Before noon, the square was crowded with people. The militia members formed a circle, blocking everyone outside the pile of firewood. It seemed that the free food was quite attractive. At least half of the townspeople had come, Roland thought. The only drawback was that the square was a little small. Except for the open space around the pile of firewood, more than 1,000 people were almost shoulder to shoulder. It was difficult to have a space to move. He also saw that some children had climbed onto the nearest roof and were looking at the middle of the square. It was the first celebration. It was inevitable that there would be some shortcomings. Roland estimated that it was almost time, so he went on stage to give a speech. This was the second time he gave a public speech in the square, so he was much calmer than the last time. My people, good noon. I am the 4th Prince of Grey Castle Kingdom, Roland Wimbledon. He still chose the same opening as last time, but this time the effect was completely different. The voice had not yet fallen. The crowd had already burst into enthusiastic cheers. Long live His Royal Highness! Long live His Royal Highness! Roland suddenly felt his chest heat up. This time he did not arrange anyone to support him. Seeing the spontaneous cheers of the militia and the crowd, a sense of achievement and satisfaction filled his heart. When the cheers subsided, he pressed down his hand. The months of the demons is over. Under the heroic efforts of the militia, the demonic beasts have never been able to cross the wall. Border Town defeated the terrible enemy with a very small price, which proves that as long as everyone is united, even if we do not rely on the charity of Longsong Stronghold, we can still stand firm here. They wanted to threaten the town with food, they wanted to force us to surrender with hunger and cold, but today's victory told them that all of this is futile. That's right, I never want to go back to that place. Following His Royal Highness, there will not be a day of hunger in winter. Finally, we don't have to be blackmailed by them. His Royal Highness is merciful. Taking advantage of the rising mood of the crowd, Roland continued to say loudly, "Let us celebrate this glorious victory. This is a day worth remembering. I declare, from now on, the first day after the end of the months of the demons will be called Victory Day. The celebration party is precisely for this. My people, enjoy this day to the fullest. Now, the party begins." Chapter 90. 6 marinated whole cows were carted to the bonfire. If not for the militia escorting them, Roland suspected that when the cart passed through the crowd, the whole cows would have been divided up by the enthusiastic crowd. This was all the stock in the castle basement. Thinking that he would not have any steak to eat until the next merchant ship arrived, Roland felt like crying. In order to hold this celebration, he had taken out everything he had. The royal chef from King City was only responsible for smearing the sauce and supervising the fire. The barbecue task was handed over to the 6 strong militia members. An iron pole was inserted into the cow's body through its mouth and placed on a brick platform next to the fire. The fire was burning so fiercely that people could feel the heat wave from 2 or 3 meters away. Soon, the whole cow's skin made a sizzling sound, and the fat came out of its pores, exuding a tempting fragrance. Of course, they couldn't let everyone wait while they were barbecuing, so under Roland's signal, Iron Axe led a group of militia members onto the stage. Those gorgeous and complex court dances were not suitable for such an occasion. Without a long period of training, they might not even be able to remember the essentials of the movements, let alone show a beautiful dance. To ensure that the dance was easy to understand and at the same time, the Sand Nation's dance was obviously more in line with the taste of the common people. Iron Axe and the militia members put their hands on their hips, one of their hands passing through the arm of their companion on the right, forming 2 rings around the fire. With the accompaniment, that is, several high and low horns sounded, they began to move in a clockwise direction. With each step they took, the other foot would kick forward, while shouting, "Ha hey." "Is this what you call a lead dance?" Carter's eyes widened. "Is this also considered a dance?" "Of course it is, and it's simple and easy to remember. Last night, the militia only practiced for a quarter of an hour before they mastered the steps." Roland laughed. "Do you want to try it?" Carter shook his head and refused. He felt as if something in his heart had broken. Farewell, that beautiful girl. Farewell, those slightly sad memories of youth. The other militia members clapped their hands and followed the steps of the dancers. Every time they took a turn, there would be a round of applause. The strong sense of rhythm inspired the crowd, and they all reached out their hands to do the same. As the applause became faster and faster, Iron Axe and his teammates spun faster and faster, and the human ring began to show signs of disconnection. Not long after, a member of the team accidentally fell down, and then a group of people fell down with him, and the rotation came to an abrupt end. The crowd was stunned, but the applause of the militia did not stop at all. Instead, it became like a storm. Iron Axe helped the fallen man up and shouted to the crowd, "Do you understand? Who wants to give it a try?" If they fell, it would be the end of this round. Everyone who joins the dance will get a piece of delicious honey-roasted meat. The longer you stay, the more meat you'll get. If it was an invitation from a noble or a big family, the townspeople might not necessarily participate. Subconsciously, they were always high and mighty and regarded the civilians as worthless. It was common for them to go back on their word. However, when they saw the militia members, who were their familiar neighbors, waving at them, they couldn't hold back anymore. With the first one, there was soon a second, then a third. A new round of dancing began again, but this time, most of the dancers were replaced by the crowd. Although the movements were simple, everyone enjoyed it. With the honey-roasted meat as a reward, the participants gave their best performance. This was exactly what Roland wanted to see. In addition to the roasted meat, there was also bread, fish cakes, and ale, which would be distributed after the beef was distributed. The celebration would last until the evening, but Roland would not stay here all the time. He arranged for Carter to be responsible for the security of the scene. The assistant minister came to give a closing speech and then left. He still had a private celebration party to attend, which was held in the castle's back garden. When the evening fell, the backyard was still brightly lit. Like in the center of the square, there was also a bonfire. The only difference was that the chicken used for barbecue was all cut into pieces. The seasoning and oil were also made by themselves, completely imitating the way of barbecue in the wild. This novel way of self-help made the witches fall in love with it. Of course, in Roland's eyes, it was also a rare spectacle. For example, Anna put the seasoning on the chicken and then directly wrapped it in green fire, instantly cooking a piece of delicious chicken. Nightingale showed her incredible knife skills. The knife in her hand appeared and disappeared, flying up and down around the chicken, peeling it, and then the bones fell off. Of course, there was also wine. These bottled wine from Willowtown was obviously more suitable for women's taste than ale. Lightning alone drank half a bottle. Although Roland wanted to say that minors were not allowed to drink, she was holding the bottle and floating in the air, so it was difficult to dissuade her, so he gave up. Halfway through the barbecue, Roland felt slightly drunk. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the group of laughing girls in front of him, and suddenly felt very gratified. This was the life a prince should have, he thought, and also for the witches. With their extraordinary ability and appearance, they should not be the target of hunting. Chapter 91. Moonlight shone through the window in the corridor, illuminating half of the woman's face. Her eyes reflected a faint blue light, like stars in the dark. Anna's body leaned against the door. Most of her body was in the shadow, but her outline was still faintly visible. Good nutrition made her not as thin as she was at first. As a woman who had just reached adulthood, her figure was just right, containing the unique youthful charm of her age. Roland pretended to be calm and slowly walked forward. Anna also saw him, stood up straight and looked him in the eyes. "It was just an accident, I didn't know she would," he said. "I understand. She was still young, I didn't care at all. I also understand." Contrary to what Roland had expected, Anna did not seem to be throwing a tantrum. There was not a trace of displeasure on her face. Instead, she looked very serious. Her lake blue eyes did not have the slightest ripple. Roland realized that she was still a straightforward woman. She did not like to pretend, and she did not need to pretend. Sure enough, she took the initiative to say, "I can't be like Lightning, who dared to do such bold behavior in front of everyone, so I can only wait for you here." After saying this, her cheeks were obviously a little red, but even so, she did not flinch. Her eyes were still looking straight at Roland, and her expression could be said to be extremely serious. Roland's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to say something, but at this moment, all words seemed redundant. She might mind Lightning's actions, but being wronged or complaining was not her way of doing things. She would only express her own demands straightforwardly. An honest and hard-working child should not be rejected, he thought. Bending down, Roland put his cheek close to Anna. Her breath blew slightly, like a spring breeze that plucked at his heartstrings. The slightly nervous breathing was clearly heard in the silent corridor, and then, a soft lips gently pressed on Roland's cheek. "Good night, Your Highness," Anna whispered. Vendi leaned against the headboard and flipped through the book in her hand. For her, this was a rare leisure time, a life she had never dared to dream of when she was in the Witch Cooperation Association. It hadn't been long since she came to Border Town, but she had already developed the habit of washing her body before going to bed, putting on a silk nightgown, not fastening it at the waist nor buttoning it. Sitting cross-legged on the bed, with a soft pillow behind her back, she would read the books she had borrowed from His Royal Highness. Today, it took a lot of time to settle down Lightning, so she didn't plan to go back to the back garden. Instead, she went straight to bed after washing up. This was a history book about the origins of the church. Although she grew up in a convent, she did not know much about it. The nun repeatedly told them to listen to God, but she never mentioned God's name. This puzzled her when she was young. Everyone had a name, but why didn't the noblest god have one? What was recorded in the book was basically the same as the rumors she had heard later. In the beginning, there were 3 major churches on the continent, each of them considered the other as heretics, believing in the evil god. This war of faith lasted for nearly 100 years, and finally the current church won, claiming that the evil god had been destroyed. From now on, God only had one name, which was the word God itself. The rest of the book described the glory and immortality of the church, including the establishment of the old holy city and the new holy city, as well as the victory against the evil witches. This made Vendi feel very strange. She had borrowed the history of Grey Castle and a brief history of the continent from His Royal Highness Roland. The first book recorded the establishment, development, and major events of the kingdom in almost every detail. For example, the names of the kings, their marriages, and the whereabouts of their children. The family branches recorded in the book were like a detailed genealogy. A brief history of the continent focused on the evolution of the 4 kingdoms, the alternation of power and political struggles, but the lives of the rulers of each kingdom were still important. But in the history of the church, there was no mention of the name of any pope, or in other words, just like God, the word pope directly replaced the names of the previous leaders. Reading the whole book, it seemed as if he alone had gone through hundreds of years of history. This was simply not in line with common sense. Rather than a record, it was better to say that it was deliberately diluted. At this moment, Nightingale suddenly appeared in the room. Vendi put down the book and looked at the other with great interest. "It's so late, but you actually have time to come here?" The latter rubbed her neck, walked to the bed and sat down. "I just sent Nana home. Where's Lightning?" She fell asleep as soon as she laid on the bed, and her mouth kept muttering "Daddy, Daddy." Vendi shrugged. "She usually looks bold, but she's still a child." "In your eyes, everyone is a child." Nightingale snatched the book from her hands. "His Royal Highness said that you should try not to read at night, especially sitting on the bed. If the light is not enough, it will harm your eyesight." "Yes, yes," His Royal Highness said. The two chatted for a while, from Silver City to the impassable mountain range, from hearing that a witch had been killed in Border Town to joining hands with the prince to fight against the months of demons. Nightingale spoke a word or two, and from time to time Vendi also spoke a few words. This was the tacit understanding that the two had formed after being inseparable for the past 5 years. Time passed slowly until the candle was about to go out. Vendi covered her mouth and laughed. "What, after seeing Lightning's actions, you can't sleep?" "What are you talking about? What else could it be?" Vendi smiled and shook her head. "Veronica, we are witches, you should know that." Nightingale was silent, and after a long time, she softly responded, "Yes." This was fate, the fate that all witches could not escape. Vendi stopped smiling and sighed. "Roland Wimbledon is the kingdom's 4th prince, and what we have to do is to help him ascend the throne, to become the king of Grey Castle. He will govern the country well and give us a place to live. But he is still a king. When the time is right, he will marry the daughter of a duke or the princess of another kingdom and then give birth to children. Either one or many, or a boy or a girl. The boys will inherit the country, and the girls will marry other prominent nobles." At this point, Vendi paused for a moment, and then said the words that Nightingale, or rather, all witches did not want to hear. "Veronica, we are witches, and witches are unable to bear children. Even if you think optimistically, after His Royal Highness has been in power for 100 years, the sisters will finally be no different from ordinary people, and can walk freely in every land of the kingdom. Occasionally, there will be outstanding witches who enter the upper class and are conferred as nobles, but the fact that witches are unable to bear children is still unchangeable. They will not have descendants to continue the glory of their family, and similarly, those aristocratic families will not consider marrying a wish. God gives us something but at the same time takes away something from us. This is fate." She whispered, "May you be merciful." "I understand," she whispered. After sending Nightingale away, Vendi's heart was also not very good, but she believed that the other would be able to come out. After all, they had overcome so many difficulties and would not easily fall on this hurdle. Chapter 92. In this way, our task is over, right? In the square, Cat's Claw cleaned up the remains of the bonfire and said regretfully, "I really don't want to go back to work in the mine. To be honest, I miss the months of the demons." "Yes, I also don't want to deal with those stones," Jop answered. "The most important thing is that the pay difference is too big. Where else would there be a job like the artillery team, where there is meat to eat every day and a monthly salary of 15 silver royals?" "What nonsense are you talking about?" Vanu, who was holding a torch to illuminate the surroundings, snapped. This time His Royal Highness gave out a lot of food, so no one starved to death during the months of the demons. Think about the last 2 years. Half of the people in the old district didn't survive the winter. Do you still miss it? Besides, the team will not be disbanded. His Royal Highness recruited us into the artillery team and burned so much gunpowder just to listen to the sound. But the demonic beasts are gone. Why does His Royal Highness still need the artillery team? Rodney asked, leaning on his broom. The artillery team was not prepared for demonic beasts. Vanner thought for a moment, but in the end he didn't say it. "Anyway, we'll know the answer tomorrow." He yawned and waved his hand impatiently. "Hurry up and clean up this place. I want to go back and sleep early." The next morning, the assembly call resounded throughout the camp, confirming Van Er's statement. After everyone had gathered, Iron Axe stood in front of the team and said loudly, "You have completed the first stage of the task, to protect Border Town from the demonic beasts. After 3 months and 6 days of fighting, you have won the approval of His Royal Highness. Next, the militia will be reorganized into His Royal Highness regular army. If you don't want to continue fighting, you can stand up now." His Royal Highness said that if you leave the militia, you will be given full pay and an additional 25 silver royals as. He thought about His Royal Highness' words, well, retirement pay. Among the 300 people, no one moved, only Cat's Claw raised his hand and said, "Report." This was also one of the strange rules set by His Royal Highness during the training. The team members were not allowed to whisper in private, and when there was something to ask, they had to first shout, "Report." Iron Axe nodded, "Speak." "What does the regular army mean? Does it mean that we are conferred the title of knight?" Vander could not help but laugh, but he quickly returned to a serious face. They were considered nobles. Not only did they have properties and squires, but they were also given land. Asking such a question was a disgrace to the artillery team. No, Iron Axe explained patiently. Apparently, he had also asked His Highness about this. The regular army is an army that specializes in fighting. They fight only to protect His Highness and protect His Highness territory. In other words, when a worker is digging in a mine, you are training. When a farmer is harvesting wheat, you are training. When a merchant is selling his goods, you are still training. All the training is for the sake of victory in future battles, just as you did during the months of the demons. Then how is it different from the militia? Cat's Claw asked again. More frequent training, stricter regulations, and more generous rewards. Report. This time it was Rodney. After Iron Axe nodded, he eagerly asked, "What's the better reward?" Vanner sighed. Why were all the guys in his group so impetuous? Although he also wanted to know the answer to this question. The regular army will implement the officer system. Those who complete combat tasks according to the designated plan or have outstanding performance can be promoted to an officer. Iron Axe said loudly, "For example, standing in my position." Is this what His Highness said? Vanna thought, if it was really implemented, wouldn't it encourage everyone to go against their superiors? He quietly looked around, but the crowd seemed not to realize this problem and still listened with relish. Officers can get a higher salary and their own land. The last sentence made the team burst into cheers. Vanner was no exception. He even wondered if he had heard wrong. If they could get their own land, what was the difference between them and the knight? But remember, once you choose to become a regular army, you will have to abide by a completely different system from the militia. For example, failure to complete a task, desertion, rebellion, and other violations of discipline will be severely punished. This is not a matter of eating an egg. The punishment includes labor, imprisonment, and even hanging. And the position and rewards obtained will also be taken back. Iron Axe paused. It's not too late to quit now. The crowd was silent. Iron Axe was silent for dozens of breaths, but still no one moved. He could not help but grin and said, "Very good, then from today on, you are a regular army under the direct command of His Highness Roland Wimbledon." Vanner himself felt that it was incredible. If he had heard those terrible punishments 3 months ago, he would have already run away. What was the use of promotion? What was the use of land? It was better to save his own life. But now, he almost did not hesitate to choose to stay here. Compared with returning to the North Slope mine and strolling around in the old district, Vanner felt that he was more suitable here. Good observation. What's your name? Mr. Vanner, work hard. Thinking of His Highness' encouragement, he once again confirmed his idea that he belonged to the militia. In the future, he would also be a member of the regular army and continue to fight for His Highness. Iron Axe soon announced the first training of the day, field training. At first, Vanner did not think it was a big deal. Running training was rarely interrupted, even during the months of demons. After breakfast, depending on the weather, they had to run 2 laps around the town, unless it snowed heavily. According to His Highness, this was good for exercise so that when defending the city wall, their hands and feet would not be stiff, and they would not be able to thrust their spears. But when the team ran out of Border Town, he immediately felt the difference between the two. At this time, the snow in the wild was far from melting. It had been snowing on and off for 3 months, and now it was knee-deep. Rather than running, it was better to say that they were crawling in the snow. The team suddenly became sparse, and it took a lot of effort to pull out one foot. There was no doubt that this special training must have been thought up by His Highness. Vanner had already seen through His Highness' idea. At this time, protests were basically useless, and the only thing they could do was to persist to the end. They spent the whole morning going back and forth. When the team returned to Border Town, Vanner only felt that his 2 legs were not his own. The snow that had been poured into their boots had turned into water, and even standing under the sun, most of the people were still shivering from the cold. The huge consumption of physical strength aggravated the cold, and even Iron Axe felt somewhat unbearable. He announced that the team was disbanded, and the lunchtime was delayed by half an hour, so that everyone could first change their soaked shoes and pants. To everyone's relief, the afternoon training was also cancelled. Of course, they did not know that Lightning had been following their training. This was also the little girl's daily training, precise control of magic and uniform flight. When she reported the information she had observed to Roland, the latter almost did not know whether to laugh or cry. Chapter 93. A few days after the victory celebration, Roland once again immersed himself in farming. Sitting in the office, he could hear the incessant dripping sound outside the window, as if it was raining. It was the sound of melting snow. When he was in the countryside during the New Year, he liked to lie by the window and watch the long ice prism under the eaves turn into transparent water droplets, dripping little by little. Although he didn't have such leisure time at the moment, he could still write a plan while listening to the sound of the Earth's recovery. According to previous year's experience, it would take about a week for the snow to melt, but it would take at least a month for the road between Border Town and Longsong Stronghold. Roland could imagine what would happen to the muddy road after the ice and snow melted without any hardened pavement or drainage measures. If he could successfully capture Longsong Stronghold, the first thing he had to do was to build a hardened road between the 2 places for carriages to pass. However, the first thing he needed to solve was the problem of army construction. Without a reliable and powerful army, it would be impossible to defeat the Stronghold army when they were outnumbered. Transforming the militia into a regular army was only the first step. The specific establishment, regulations and discipline, as well as rewards and punishments, were a headache for him. Although he had played military chess when he was a child, he had completely forgotten about it. After much thought, Roland simply decided to make up his own plans. Anyway, he was the creator of the new army. No one would find out if the settings were unreasonable. So the first army of Border Town was quickly organized. Army, division, battalion, team, and group as the overall framework, 5 people for a group, taking into account that a cannon needed at least 5 people to operate, 10 groups for a team, and 10 teams for a battalion. As for the number of divisions and armies, he decided to think about it later. In view of the overall combat level of this era, as long as there were 2 or 3 battalions, it would be enough to defeat the vast majority of opponents in the field. After the most basic framework was set, Roland breathed a long sigh of relief. The following regulations and discipline were much simpler. In addition to obeying military orders at all times, obeying officers, not deserting, not betraying, and so on, these old rules and so on, the first discipline that Roland set was to prohibit looting and harassment. The disadvantages of indulging in looting were numerous, and the bad impact on the local people would take several years to make up for. This was also the reason why he insisted on using civilians to form the army. When the nobles responded to the liege's summons, it was impossible for them not to participate in the plundering after defeating the enemy. In other words, the main reason why they were willing to follow the liege into battle was that they could plunder the enemy's wealth and territory. Of course, that included the innocent civilians in the territory. As for the mercenaries and bandits, it was needless to say. They looked fierce, but in reality, they could only fight with the wind. At the same time, robbing was a big source of income for them, so military discipline was meaningless to them. Only an army made up of commoners would not treat other commoners as lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Of course, it was not enough to rely on discipline and torture alone. As time passed, the greed in the bottom of his heart would continue to grow with each victory. Therefore, rewards must be given at the same time in order to put an end to plundering and other violations. In order to make the rewards sufficiently motivating, Roland decided to give out his ultimate weapon, granting fields for military contributions. As long as they made great contributions in battle, they would be granted a piece of land. Roland had already thought about the source of the land. It was the land between Border Town and Longsong Stronghold. In an era where 90% of the land belonged to the aristocracy, this was definitely a generous prize. Once they obtained permanent property, these people would closely adhere to him, and anyone who wanted to overthrow him would encounter the fiercest resistance from those who benefited from it. The people didn't need to be driven by words or whips, but by real benefits. In other words, as long as he could always represent the fundamental interests of the people under his rule, no one could shake his ruling position. Different from the traditional fiefdom, Roland controlled the area of the granted land to be between a few acres and a dozen acres. It could be used to build their own houses by serfs or hire farmers to take care of the fields, but it was impossible to establish an industry. In contrast, a knight's territory was close to 2,000 acres, an area equivalent to a small village. The income from the businesses above could provide for the knight and his attendants' combat needs, such as the purchase of weapons, armor, and horses. Such a small area of land as a reward would not arouse strong opposition from the aristocratic interest groups, but would also weaken the independence of the recipient. In Roland's view, it was like a retirement pension, which could ensure that soldiers would have a stable income after retirement. At the same time, in order to strengthen the centralization of power and avoid the situation of the servant's servant is never my servant, the person who granted the land only had the ownership, but no autonomy. In other words, the land still followed the laws, regulations, and systems of the lord's jurisdiction. In a sense, they were more like the farmers of the later generations. Roland stretched himself as he wrote down the rules of the preliminary system one by one. Next, he could finally devote himself to the field he was good at, the development of weapons. As the speed of the production of guns increased, continuing to assign pikemen to protect the musketeers would be a waste of manpower, and the latter must have the ability to fight independently in close combat. The solution was very simple, and that was to add a bayonet to the gun. Roland didn't expect his troops to take the initiative to launch a melee attack on the enemy. He only needed to have the strength to fight when the enemy was desperate and the cannons couldn't completely destroy the enemy's courage. Bayonets weren't difficult to make. If you wanted to pursue simplicity, it was a sharp cone, and if you wanted to further increase its lethality, you could cut a blood groove on it. The key was the connection between the bayonet and the gun. The original bayonet had a thin wooden shaft wrapped around the hilt, and the wooden shaft could be inserted directly into the gun barrel. The advantage was that it was easy to make, but the disadvantage was also very obvious. In close combat, you couldn't shoot, and after stabbing someone, it was easy to fall into a predicament where you couldn't pull it out. Roland planned to produce the improved second generation of bayonets, the casing bayonet. The end of the handle had a corner, and it was connected to an iron casing. The inner diameter of the casing was slightly larger than the barrel, and it had a groove. The barrel only needed to be welded with a piece of iron bar for the groove to be inserted, and the blade could be fixed. The blade was a triangular iron, and all three sides were sharp. After stabbing into the body, it wouldn't affect pulling it out, but at the same time, it would leave a wound that was difficult to heal. The casing bayonet, after being installed, would be slightly higher than the barrel, which would affect the loading of ammunition. But compared to the folding bayonet, it was simple enough and convenient to mass produce. As long as they made a sample, they could hand it over to the blacksmith shop to make it. To make the bayonet useful in actual combat, the key was to train the soldiers how to use it. Chapter 94. The production of the artillery was also steadily advancing. The second cannon embryo had already entered the enlarging stage, while the third cannon was still in the process of accumulating materials. If he was lucky, after a month, he would have a magnificent lineup of 4 12-pound cannons. There was no doubt about the superiority of firepower, but how to turn this advantage into victory, this was a problem that Roland had been thinking about. Before he had crossed over, he was just a mechanical dog. Like most people, his understanding of war came from history, movies and games. If it was a completely cold weapon war, he would let Carter and Iron Axe command. But this battle was not the same. No one could understand the combat style of hot weapons better than himself. That being the case, he could only combine all the knowledge he knew and use a vision that was higher than this era to formulate every step of the plan. In order to ensure victory, Roland let lightning go back and forth between Longsong's stronghold and border town every day, first to observe the road conditions, and second to accurately calculate the distance. Roland believed that victory in war was based on a lot of investigation and calculation. Whether it was the development of tactics or the deduction of the battle situation, it was inseparable from these 2 points. Using the measurements set by the last time he cast the cannon, he made several 1-meter-long iron rods and 100-meter-long hemp ropes. Then in the artillery test field west of Border Town, according to the hemp ropes and the wooden rods, he drew out a flight runway about 1 kilometer long. Lightning practiced controlling the magic consumption, repeatedly crossing the distance of 1 kilometer at a fixed speed. When she was proficient in the magic output, Roland began to measure the distance between Longsong's stronghold and Border Town. Using the sundial to get the time to go back and forth, he calculated that the distance between the 2 places was about 54 kilometers. Of course, this was only a straight line distance. In fact, if they traveled by land, they would have to make 2 big turns to avoid the foot of the impassable mountain range. In any case, if the Duke chose to march by land, it would take at least 3 days to reach Border Town. With Lightning as the scout, Roland would be able to clearly understand the enemy's position, as well as the actions to take. Within a range of 2 kilometers west of Border Town, he had inserted a lot of signal markers to mark the distance. As long as the enemy entered this range, the artillery team could quickly adjust the corresponding muzzle angle without the need for a firing meter. Now he began to worry, what if the enemy didn't come over? Just then, there was a knock on the door. Nightingale, who had been lying on the sofa and chewing on dried fish, suddenly disappeared. Roland coughed twice and said, "Come in." The assistant minister Barav opened the door. "Your Highness, there is a noble from Longsong's stronghold who wants to see you." Roland did not understand for a moment. They sent another ambassador? Barav. Roland thought for a moment. Stronghold, 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 stronghold. Barav. Roland did not understand. Roland thought for a moment before remembering that Border Town had indeed been inhabited by nobles in the stronghold. Stronghold said, "Moreover, he came here at the beginning of spring. Had he not seen the iron fists of the royal family?" What? What? Of Stronghold roar. Was Roland roared. Roland. Stronghold cannon. Roland wanted to agree, but then he changed his mind. "Let Baron wait for me in the living room. Maybe I can use him to put a little pressure on Longsong's stronghold," the prince thought. After a quarter of an hour, Roland leisurely arrived at the living room. On one side of the long table, a man with a round belly was already waiting impatiently. He walked back and forth, his face trembling with each step. Seeing that His Royal Highness had appeared, the Baron stopped and reluctantly bowed. "Sit down." Roland returned to the main seat and sat down. According to his usual habits, even if it wasn't dinner time, he would let the kitchen prepare a dessert, but today he didn't even let them prepare a cup of tea. "Your Highness," Baron Cornelius hadn't even sat down when he hurriedly said, "How could you let those stupid masons tear down my house?" It was a good house. The walls were made of stone bricks, and the beams and roof were made of the best quality logs. When I built it, it cost me 150 golden dragon. He stretched out his fingers and gestured. 150, Roland sneered twice in his heart. If he had just arrived in Border Town with the prince's memory, he might have believed it. But now, do you mean the house in the westernmost part of the town? Cornelius nodded again and again. Yes, that's it. It's the second largest house in the town after Baron Simon's house. That's a pity. It's too close to the wall, blocking the passage of my men. Roland paused for a moment. But the city hall has already made compensation? How much? Roland stretched out 2 fingers. 20 golden dragon? That's too little. Your Highness. Cornelius opened his mouth, as if he wanted to argue, but in the end he held back. He took out a handkerchief and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Well, 20 golden dragon, where should I go to get this money? Roland pretended to be puzzled. This money has already been paid to the owner of the house. What? I am the owner of the house. Not you, it's Blair, the captain of my 2nd militia. Who is that? The Baron shouted loudly. Your Highness, you are mistaken. I am the owner of that house. Is that so? But I didn't see you during the winter. Roland raised his eyebrows. How can you say that house is yours? Of course I went back to Long Song's stronghold. Who would want to stay in this damned place? If I'm not careful, I will be fed to the demonic beasts. Idiot, Roland evaluated him in his heart, but he still maintained a flat tone. So you want to say that because you were afraid of the demonic beasts, you abandoned your lord and ran away, is that it? The Baron suddenly froze. Guards, Roland clapped his hands. 2 guards immediately came in from the outside of the living room, sandwiching Cornelius in the middle. Your Highness, what do you mean by this? It's very simple, now you have 2 choices. Roland stood up from his seat and contemptuously looked at the other side. First, you admit that you were wrong, that house doesn't belong to you, I can treat it as a farce, and now let you go. Second, during the months of the demons, you betrayed your lord, left your territory without permission, and shamefully fled to Long Song's stronghold. I will put you in prison, and then hang you for defection. Which do you choose? Cornelius's forehead was sweating profusely. He swallowed his saliva, hesitated for a while, and then said with a trembling voice, Your Highness, I made a mistake, that house isn't my house. So this is a misunderstanding. Roland shrugged and said to the guards, Send Mr. Baron out of here. When Cornelius came to the door, the prince stopped him. That's right, when you return to Long Song's stronghold by boat, help me send a message. Tell those, the nobles who will have the same misunderstanding as you. If you don't intend to choose the second option, then you don't have to waste your time coming to Border Town. As you wish, Your Highness, Cornelius said with a forced smile, but the moment he turned around, Roland saw the other side gnashing his teeth. Chapter 95. Damn it. What kind of bullshit prince is he? Isn't he just a poor guy who was thrown into the wilderness? Cornelius thought fiercely, but looking at the 2 guards holding the hilt of their swords behind him, he had to temporarily swallow his anger into his stomach. Walking out of the castle gate, he saw the guards turn around and leave, so the Baron was relieved. He pulled out a wet handkerchief and wiped his forehead, fiercely spitting out a mouthful of spittle, while imagining the scene of the spittle hitting the prince's face. This wasn't enough to vent his anger, so he stamped his foot on the spittle twice, feeling a little better. So what if you blocked the demonic beasts? Do you think you can stand firm in the western region? Continue to be proud, let's see how long you can be proud. Cornelius thought, if he hadn't received reliable information he wouldn't have come to Border Town so early. Generally speaking, the nobles would return to Border Town later than the civilians. After all, mining and hunting were not their turn. They only needed to go to the mine every once in a while to supervise the production and wait for the day of the ore delivery. In their spare time, they could also go to the hunters' homes to see if there were any suitable high-quality furs to buy. But this year, the situation had changed. Cornelius heard from the chief financial officer, Sir Reynolds, that the Duke Ryan was ready to drive the 4th prince out of the western region. This wasn't a betrayal of the Grey Castle Kingdom, but an order from the new king, Timothy Wimbledon. Roland Wimbledon is no longer the lord of Border Town. The new territory needs to be reconferred after he returns to King City. Who was Sir Reynolds? He was the favorite of the Duke. In just a short 5 years, he climbed from a municipal official to the position of chief financial officer. If he hadn't used his relationship with his distant relatives to send him 2 good furs every year, how could he have known the thoughts of the western region's ruler? Reconferring the new territory after he returns to King City was just a nice way of saying it. Even Cornelius knew that the eldest prince had been sent to the guillotine without saying a word. When the fourth prince returned, wouldn't he be at the mercy of the new king? There was no doubt that the western region belonged to the duke. If it was only a unilateral order from His Majesty Timothy, then it was still open to discussion. But when the duke was ready to go, Roland Wimbledon was no different from a stray dog. This was also the reason why Cornelius had rushed to Border Town. Firstly, he wanted to collect some furs as soon as possible, and secondly, he wanted to sell the house. First of all, his calculations were very shrewd. In previous years, the civilians had fled to Longsong's stronghold to take refuge, so naturally, they didn't have much stock. But this year, they had been staying here all the time, so how could they not receive a few good goods? Not only could he earn a small sum of money, but he could also give a gift to Lord Reynold. The second point was that Cornelius had asked Lord Reynold to arrange a seat for him in the city hall. Although it was an idle job, it was better than this damned poor place. Since he couldn't use the house anymore, he had to get rid of it as soon as possible. Who knows when the Duke will make his move? In case this group of untouchable people accidentally burned down their houses, it would be a big loss. However, he had never expected that the house would not be burned down by the untouchables. Instead, it would be torn down by the fourth prince. Thinking of this, Baron was so angry that his teeth itched. A good house. Although 150 golden dragons was somewhat exaggerated, but 30 golden dragons was still worth it. In order to get the money as soon as possible, he had retreated again, and even 20 golden dragons was barely acceptable, but His Highness actually treated him like this. He didn't even take out a single coin, and even threatened me with the crime of defection. Didn't he know that every year during the months of the demons, all the nobles would evacuate from this place? Cornelius slowed down his pace, and suddenly felt that something was wrong. Although he had heard before that the fourth prince had a bad character and acted without thinking, and that when he had just arrived in Border Town he had maliciously molested Baron Simon's wife, and had been privately discussed as a joke for a long time. But today, the feeling he got was completely different. The prince didn't become angry out of humiliation or act shamelessly. The way he behaved was completely different from his bad character and his acting without thinking. The other side had been talking to him in a normal tone, so why was he so scared that he obediently gave up the ownership of the house? Could it be that if he insisted that the house was His Highness would really kill him? That's right. Cornelius couldn't help but shiver, and the sweat on his forehead shrank back. Now that he thought about it, when he was facing the prince, he had the illusion that he was talking to His Excellency the Duke. Baron shook his head vigorously, trying to put this unpleasant memory to the back of his mind. Anyway, the fourth prince wouldn't be so proud for a few days. When Duke Ryan brought Border Town back under his control, and when he escorted Roland Wimbledon to King City, he would have to laugh at him. Maybe with these 20 golden dragon coins, I can ask His Excellency the Duke to help me seek justice. Thinking of this, he relaxed. Since he had received a few good furs, he didn't need to sell the house. He might as well just go back to Longsong's stronghold. Saying, "I will inform the nobles who will have the same misunderstanding," was simply too pretentious. When he returned to Longsong's stronghold, he had to imitate it for everyone to hear, so that everyone could see what it meant to be a bluff. Leaving the castle area, Cornelius walked down the long slope and passed by a woman wearing a hood. Originally, this wasn't strange. Among the townspeople coming and going, the women were all dressed like this. If you wanted to see a beautiful young lady or a noble lady, you had to go to King City. But when a gust of wind blew the corner of the woman's hood, Cornelius felt his heart jump, and the surrounding air seemed to solidify. My God, what kind of woman is she? She has a rare long green hair, and just by revealing her face for a moment, she can already be called a stunning beauty. Even if she was placed in Grey Castle King City, those so-called princesses would be overshadowed. How could such a person appear in Border Town? He turned his head, wanting to catch up with her to see what was going on, but found that she was walking towards the castle area. Is this His Highness the Prince's woman? Baron hesitated, and finally chose to give up. He really didn't want to deal with the fourth prince anymore. This kind of villain should be handed over to His Excellency the Duke to deal with. It would be better for him to return to Longsong's stronghold as soon as possible. From the pier, he boarded his own single-masted clipper. The boatman pulled up the sails, and the boat quickly left the pier, heading in the direction of Longsong stronghold. On the way back, Cornelius, who was sitting on the bow and basking in the sun, saw a spectacle. About 5 miles away from border town in the snow, a large group of people appeared in his field of vision. They were all wearing the same dark brown leather armor, with long wooden spears on their backs. They were lined up in a long line, slowly walking through the snow. Although they were separated by a layer of forest, and he couldn't see the whole line, but he could tell that there were at least 100 people. This is the farmers that the fourth prince used to fight against the demonic beasts? At the beginning of the month, when the snow hadn't melted, it could be said that there were very few people on the road. How difficult it was to walk in the snow, Cornelius didn't have to try it, but he could imagine it. But this group of people all lowered their heads and hurried on their way, as if they didn't care about the foot-deep snow under their feet. Chapter 96. Seeing the busy people around her, Leaf never thought that she would be so close to a town in the secular world one day. After entering the boundary of border town, the low brick bungalows, like a dusty memory, appeared in front of her one after another. Obviously, she had escaped to the impassable mountain range for less than half a year, but she felt that the scene in front of her was so strange that it was like another world. The months of demons had just passed, and the townspeople had gone through a winter of lack of food and clothing, so their complexion and health should be very bad. Leaf remembered that the Witch Cooperation Association had passed through the slums of Silver City in the winter. There were starving and frozen bodies everywhere, and the people who were still alive were like walking corpses, numb and sluggish. But here, most of the people she saw were full of energy. Some were drying dried fish in front of the house, some climbed on the roof to repair broken tiles, and most of them were strong men carrying hoes and hammers, talking and laughing with each other as they walked north of the town. In such a situation, Leaf would pull down the brim of her hat and try to avoid them as much as possible. The location of the castle was very eye-catching. It was on a high hillside in the southwest corner of the town. There were no usable plants around, so it would be very difficult to sneak in quietly. Hiding in the trunk of a tree to avoid the enemy was possible, but to let the tree climb up and send her in would make too much noise. She was not a witch who was good at hiding, so after thinking it over, Leaf felt that instead of hiding, it would be better to walk into the castle openly. If Nightingale did not lie to her, even if she walked through the front door, there would not be any problem. If Nightingale lied to her, and lied to the Sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association, she was sure that she could escape from the 2 guards in front of the door. Of course, the worst-case scenario was that Nightingale completely betrayed everyone and relied on hunting witches to work for the prince. In that case, she would most likely die here. As a top combat witch, few people could escape from Nightingale's pursuit. Even someone as strong as Kara did not have the confidence to win. Leaf had already prepared for the worst. If she could not return alive, Scroll would take over the position of a mentor and lead the sisters to continue on their journey. As for where their destination was, no one knew the answer. She slowly walked up the hill and approached the castle gate. The guard quickly noticed her. He placed his hand on the hilt of his sword and shouted, "This is the prince's temporary imperial residence. You shouldn't be here. Back off." He paused, then added, "If you have something urgent to report, go straight down this road to the left, and go to the town hall. There will be someone there to receive you." Leaf took a deep breath and took off her hood. Unsurprisingly, she saw the 2 of them show a surprised expression at the same time. Without waiting for them to recover, she bluntly said, "I'm a witch." The moment she said this, she was prepared for the guards to draw their swords. But the 2 guards just glanced at each other. They didn't show any of the disgust that ordinary people would show when they heard about a witch. One of them even asked with interest, "Witch, what can I do for you?" This reaction made Leaf's heart beat faster. She suppressed the excitement that was about to burst out and said as calmly as possible, "I want to see Nightingale. Or Anna and Nana can do it." In Nightingale's story, witches were frequent visitors to the castle. His Royal Highness didn't restrict their freedom, and the guards who guarded the castle turned a blind eye to them coming in and out of the castle under the instruction of Prince Roland. If what Nightingale said was true, it was impossible for the guards not to have heard of their names. The guard who asked the question patted his partner on the shoulder and said, "You stay here and look after her. I'll go inform His Royal Highness. Leaf watched him walk through the gate and quickly disappear into the garden. What would be waiting for her? Would it be a welcome from the sisters? Or would it be a siege by the guards? Or would it be a sharp blade from the shadows? She found herself caught in a strange contradiction. She obviously wanted to believe in Nightingale, but the closer she got to the answer, the more afraid she was of being disappointed. Could it be that Nightingale had changed her name here and was not called this at all? Could it be that Anna and Nana were made up by her? Or, time had never moved so slowly before. Every heartbeat seemed to cross 100 years. In the long time, she quietly waited for her fate. She didn't know how long it had been, or maybe it was just a short moment, but she heard Nightingale's voice. In a trance, she thought she had heard wrong. A familiar figure appeared from behind the door and rushed toward her, arriving almost at the same time as the voice. Then, she was embraced by a warm body. Leaf, welcome home. These are my spare clothes. You can wear them first. Nightingale rummaged through the wardrobe. And a coat, shoes? Well, a nightgown and a bath towel. Why are you in such a hurry? Vendi shook her head with a smile. When His Royal Highness gets up, he'll take care of her. Looking at Nightingale, who was busy, Leaf's eyes became warm again. She sniffed, bit her lips, and wiped away her tears. She was afraid that if she opened her mouth, she would be unable to hold back her tears. It turned out that Nightingale hadn't lied to her. A prince who was willing to be kind to witches really existed. Do you want to take a hot bath first? You must be tired from rushing over from the camp. Nightingale put the bath towel and clothes beside Leaf. His Royal Highness is taking a nap. When he wakes up, he'll be very happy to see you. By the way, have you found the Holy Mountain? How are the other sisters? As soon as this question came out, Leaf's vision suddenly became blurred. She couldn't bear it any longer. She hugged Nightingale and released all the pain she had been suppressing in her heart these days. She cried until Nightingale's chest was completely soaked. Only then did Leaf gradually calm down. Then she told the story of what had happened to her sisters after the three of them left the Witch Cooperation Association. When she talked about how many of her sisters had died in the barbarian land, she felt Nightingale involuntarily clench her hand. When Leaf finished her story, Vendi's expression became extremely heavy. I didn't expect that Kara would lead the Witch Cooperation Association to a dead end. Only 7 of our 42 sisters were left. I also have an unshirkable responsibility. If I had stood firmly on Nightingale's side. It's not your fault, Nightingale said sadly. No one can predict the future. The key is what to do next. She looked at Leaf. You said that there are 6 sisters who survived. Where are they? They are waiting for my news at the entrance of the canyon. We agreed that if I couldn't return, Scroll would take them away from here, or to the southernmost corner, or across the strait. Then we have to hurry and bring them back, Nightingale immediately said. I'll set off now. Vendi, I'll leave Leaf in your care. Wait, what if they don't believe you? Leaf also has to go and call Lightning. She should be practicing flying in the west of the town at the moment. You can take a few more horses with you so that the sisters can walk less. Vendi carefully said. But His Royal Highness, isn't he still sleeping? Leaf was stunned. Don't you need to ask him? Chapter 97. When Roland entered the office, he was surprised to find that the one in the room was not Nightingale, but Vendi. What happened? He poured himself a cup of warm water. Where is Nightingale? She went to meet her sisters. Really? Roland picked up the cup and was about to take a sip, when he suddenly felt something was wrong. Wait, what sisters? The sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association. They came to Border Town, Vendi replied. Didn't they go to find the Holy Mountain? He suddenly stood up. How many people came? The one who wanted to hurt Nightingale. I think she was called Kara the Snake Witch. Did she also come? No, Your Highness, they couldn't find the Holy Mountain. In the wasteland, they encountered a terrible monster, and in the end only 7 of them survived. Vendi repeated Leaf's narration, then bowed and apologized. At that time you were still taking a nap. Please forgive me for making the decision to let Nightingale and Lightning pick them up. It doesn't matter, Roland waved his hand. You know I won't blame you for this kind of thing. What kind of abilities do they have? I don't know, but I heard from Leaf that they aren't fighting witches. Maybe? Vendi hesitated. They won't be of much use to you. Non-fighting witches? Roland's heart was suddenly full of expectations. Under the constraints of the god's stone of retaliation and the effective range of the witches, their fighting ability was actually very limited. Production was their best field. If there was a witch who specialized in plastic, he could solve the problem of rough processing technology, directly entering the era of large-scale mechanical production. If there was a witch who could generate electricity, Border Town's night would be as bright as day. Next, he would become the king. He would marry a witch, reach the peak of his life, and lead everyone to achieve the 4 modernizations. Just thinking about it made him excited. Your Highness, don't you need them? Perhaps the long silence made Vendi worried. She asked in a low voice. No, how could that be? Roland came back to his senses and said word by word, I'll take in as many witches as you want. Just as the sun was setting, Nightingale took the rest of the Sisters of the Witch Cooperation Association back to the castle, while Roland prepared a sumptuous dinner in the castle hall as a welcome feast. The witches were obviously very hungry, but since it was the first time they were eating in such an environment, everyone was very reserved. This was the first time most of them had seen the Lord, not to mention that the Lord was a prince. Fortunately, in addition to Roland himself, there were also 2 local witches, Anna and Nana, to demonstrate. With the addition of Lightning, who didn't know what awkwardness was, to liven up the atmosphere, everyone finally relaxed a little, and there were sounds of conversation at the banquet. Roland chewed on a piece of fried bread as he sized up the group of women in front of him who had completely different styles but could all be considered beautiful. This was the greatness of magic. Even if in the future there was no need for witches to participate in the development of technology, their appearance would always be a scenery that would never fade away. Carr's model district had not yet been completed, so the witches could only live in the castle for the time being. There were still 4 empty rooms on the 2nd floor. Roland thought about it and decided to change the single room into a shared room for 2 people. After all, the big beds were prepared for visiting nobles and could accommodate 2 people. After the dinner, the prince finally ushered in the long-awaited part, the ability questioning. The witches, accompanied by Nightingale, took turns to enter the office. Roland acted like an interviewer, recording each of their characteristics, and for the first time, he used the god's stone of retaliation to test the effect of their abilities. The whole process was like a job fair. When the last witch was done with her questioning, Roland's eyes widened. He let out a long breath and stretched himself. If he wasn't afraid that Nightingale might be squatting on the side and eavesdropping, he really wanted to hum a superstar. Although he didn't find a witch who specialized in shaping and generating electricity, the progress of the modernization would be delayed, but this batch of witches still brought Roland a great surprise. The most important one was the witch named Leaf. He spread the records on the table one by one and pulled out the records about her. Before adulthood, Leaf's ability was still limited to increasing the fruit of plants. After adulthood, this ability was greatly improved and derived a branch ability, plant manipulation. The first ability could be used to improve fruits and seeds, increase production, and enhance the effect of herbs. The branch ability gave her the possibility to change the characteristics of plants. According to her, by injecting magic into plants, she could make dead branches grow green leaves, she could command weeds to entangle the enemy, and she could even integrate herself with the tree. However, the larger the size of the plant, the more magic it would take to control it. Therefore, when fighting, she preferred to choose weeds, which had a faster effect and a lower cost. The way to use this ability was through contact, and it could be transmitted through a physical medium, such as the ground, with an effective range of about 5 meters. There was no doubt that this witch with long green hair was definitely a good helper in the development of agriculture. Her importance was self-evident. Industrialization required a large population, and a large population depended on enough food to support it. These food could either be produced by themselves or imported through trade. If the former didn't have efficient production capacity, most of the human resources would be tied to the land. The latter was even more difficult to achieve in an era when transportation was extremely underdeveloped. Now that he had harvested a druid, Roland hoped to use a small number of farmers to feed a large number of industrial people, speeding up the industrialization process of his territory. Therefore, in the future direction of practice, he decided to let Leaf improve the road of seeds, whether it was wheat or barley. As long as she could increase the yield of any one of them, he could greatly increase the upper limit of his territory's population. In addition, he heard that the fjords produced some unique food, which, according to Lightning's description, was very similar to potatoes and corn. If the rumors were true, then the plan to introduce these two crops had to be put on the agenda as soon as possible. After all, wheat itself wasn't a high-yielding crop. After writing down the practice plan, Roland put her information aside and pulled out a second piece of paper from the table. The second witch to be questioned was called Scroll, and she was also the oldest of the 7 people. This year she was already close to 40 years old. This was a rare age among the witches. The older they got, the harder it was to resist the bite of magic. However, after seeing the description of her ability, Roland could also understand why Scroll could live until now. Her main ability was a memory that was far beyond that of ordinary people. After reaching adulthood, her ability had stabilized, and she could almost be said to have a photographic memory. At the same time, she had also obtained a very interesting branch ability. Scroll could turn the books she had read into reality for a short period of time, which Roland named Book of Illusion. Her main ability was almost always in effect, so every day of awakening Scroll could safely pass through it. This was also the reason why she was self-taught even though she was born in a poor family. This ability greatly improved her learning, especially when it came to learning words that needed to be memorized repeatedly. Every time she used her branch ability, it would consume all of her body's magic power. The time that the Book of Illusion could exist was determined by the remaining magic power, usually between a quarter of an hour to an hour. Chapter 98. The third witch was called Hummingbird. She was a short witch, just like her nickname. When asked about her ability, she was much more reserved than the other witches. She had just reached adulthood this winter. With symmetrical dimples, delicate facial features, and a soft voice, she looked exceptionally cute. Her ability was to lighten objects. After attaching her magic to an object, she could greatly reduce its weight. According to her, it was close to 0. After Roland let Hummingbird use her own teacup to demonstrate, he found that the cup could almost float in the air. That is to say, its weight was equal to that of air. Of course, in the eyes of the people of this era, air had no weight. It seemed that this was also the reason why the Witch Cooperation Association could cross the western border of Grey Castle without any supplies. With the little girl's help, bags of wheat and dried fish could be easily carried on the road. Only a few people could carry a large amount of supplies, which could greatly reduce the logistical pressure. Although Hummingbird was an adult, she didn't have a derivative ability. Her main ability had to be in contact with the target to be cast, and was ineffective against living beings. The larger the object, the longer the conversion time, and the more magic it consumed. Once the conversion was completed, it could last for several hours. This ability seemed to be very suitable for the transportation industry and had great potential in the upcoming war. However, there were too many unknown factors, so further tests were needed to be done. Roland wrote at the bottom of the parchment, "Practice with stones of different weights, control the magic output, and accurately control the effective and ineffective time." After dealing with the training plans of the 3 witches, he asked the attendant to add a new candlestick, making the room brighter. But even so, under the wavering orange candlelight, reading and writing were both laborious for the eyes. Roland yawned. He spread out the parchment with the information of the 4th witch. The 4th witch had a rare surname. Her full name was Soroya Zwaen, and she came from a merchant family in Grey Castle. She had short brown curly hair and a pair of slender eyes. The little freckles on the bridge of her nose didn't ruin her overall beauty, but instead made her exude a unique, youthful vitality. Soroya had just turned 19, and her ability was very special. After she became an adult, she could draw the people and scenery that she saw or imagined. Coupled with her magic pen branch ability, she could draw photographic-like images without the aid of paint or relying on paper. This ability, which was comparable to a camera, had countless uses. As for training, she could draw a few pictures every day. He pulled out the next piece of paper. The fifth witch was called Echo. She was a woman from the southernmost region. She was tall and had brown skin. Her eyes and nose were typical of the Sand Nation. It was full of exotic charm. According to her, after awakening, she could initially imitate the chirping of animals. When they reached adulthood, they would be able to imitate any voice perfectly, without any branch abilities. Roland named her ability Voice Illusion. He had no idea what it could be used for now, but the requirement for practice was to shout a few times. The sixth witch to be questioned was Lily. She was only 16 years old, with 2 ponytails and a face as delicate as a doll. When she saw Roland, her expression was a bit stiff. Her ability was to prevent food from spoiling. She had only been awakened as a witch for a short year, but she was already the most popular character in the Witch Cooperation Association. Without her ability to preserve food, a lot of food would deteriorate and become moldy during the exile. Lily and Hummingbird supported the logistics of the Witch Cooperation Association. As for whether her ability to preserve food was achieved by killing bacteria with magic power, it was still unknown. Roland decided to let her use a variety of meat and fruit to practice, and also to test the longest preservation time under the condition that her magic power was exhausted. He rubbed his sore neck and stacked the information of the 6 witches into a pile. There was only one parchment left on the table. This was another surprise that Roland had discovered after learning about Leaf. The 7th witch, Mystery Moon. When she walked into the office, she looked very nervous. Nightingale comforted her for a long time and explained the reason in his ear. Originally, Mystery Moon's ability was the worst in the camp. It could be said that she was almost useless. She was only responsible for some chores that relied purely on human labor. In addition, she was often blamed by Kara, which made her timid. She was afraid that Roland would think that she was useless and drive her out of Border Town. Her main ability was to magnetize objects. Before she was an adult, she was only limited to metal objects, but after she became an adult, she could magnetize any object in her hands. She didn't have a branch of her ability, so she needed to touch the target to use it. The process was extremely slow. According to her, it would take half a day to magnetize a 1-foot square stone. For the Witch Cooperation Association, this was really useless. Magnets weren't something new. Ships sailing between the fjords and the mainland were equipped with navigation needles. There were many references on land, so they didn't need this kind of thing to quickly find the right direction. On the contrary, magnetized objects would cause trouble for everyone. For example, after Hummingbird lightened the iron pot, it would fly towards Mystery Moon. So Kara forbade her to use her power in the camp. But to Roland, this taciturn girl was a priceless treasure that had been delivered to his doorstep. This was also the reason why he wanted to hum Superstar. Was there any more appropriate lyrics than "You are the electricity, you are the light"? Magnetism generates electricity, electricity generates magnetism. This was a knowledge that any science student would know by heart. In his heart, he thanked Faraday, Gauss, Ampere, and Maxwell. With electricity, there would be light. Maybe it wouldn't be long before he would be able to show another miracle in his territory. A witch who was forbidden to use her ability was still able to survive the demonic bite. Although she was introverted and self-abased, her will wasn't weak. At least, her desire to live was stronger than most people. Roland secretly rejoiced that she had joined the Witch Cooperation Association less than a year ago. Otherwise, over the years, she was likely to be buried alive by Kara. With a stroke of his pen, he set Mystery Moon's training for the next few days to magnetize various objects. He also determined the relationship between magic power consumption and magnetism. With the addition of these 7 witches, Roland's witch lineup suddenly increased to 12 people. After reading so many books, he had a general understanding of the manifestations of magic power. The traditional classification of combat type and non-combat type was not reasonable. He was more inclined to divide them according to the characteristics of their abilities. Generally speaking, the main abilities of witches could be divided into 3 categories. The first category was the self-strengthening type. This type of ability was very rare. So far, only Scroll belonged to this category. This was equivalent to a passive ability that was not affected by the God's Stone of Retaliation. Even if she wore a God's Stone of Retaliation, she could still have a photographic memory. The second category was the summoning type. Anna, Nightingale, Nana, Lightning, Vendi, Leaf, Soroya, Echo and Lily all belonged to this category. The characteristic was that the magic power could leave the body and take effect, although this distance was limited to within 5 meters. The summoning type of witches had the most varied abilities, and were also the most affected by the God's Stone of Retaliation. Once they entered the anti-magic area, any magic power effect would disappear. However, before the ability was stopped, the result was permanent and irreversible. The third category was the enchantment type. For example, Hummingbird and Mystery Moon. The magic power was cast through contact with the target. The transformation process was slow and consumed a lot of magic power. At the same time, it could be interrupted by the God's Stone of Retaliation. However, once the transformation was completed, it would become an inherent property of the object, and would still be effective in the anti-magic area. The enchantment had a time limit, and the duration was related to the volume of the object and the user's magic power. This was probably the reason why the God's Stone of Retaliation could not eliminate the magic bite. Roland thought. The God's Stone of Retaliation did not affect the gathering and flow of magic power. It affected the process of magic power transformation. Generally speaking, it was aimed at the customer's front end, not the back-end data. Chapter 99. The witches were still awake. After experiencing a series of hardships, they still couldn't believe that they had been taken in by the prince. No shackles, no guards, how could they live in such a spacious and comfortable room in the castle? Vendi probably guessed the uneasiness of her sisters. She and Nightingale called everyone to her room, sat around the bed in a circle, and chatted to calm everyone's mood. This is the demeanor of a leader, Leaf thought. If it was Kara, she would never be so careful, or even if she noticed it, she wouldn't have the leisure to comfort her sisters. Sister Vendi, His Royal Highness, what would he want us to do? Hummingbird asked timidly, compared to you and Sister Nightingale, our abilities are far inferior. Her words resonated with the other sisters, and they all nodded. Vendi burst into laughter. Let me think. The first thing you have to do is to practice your ability. Practice ability? Soroya hesitated. Will His Royal Highness make me keep drawing? It's very possible. Vendi patted Mystery Moon, who had her head down. You too, although Kara forbade you to use your ability in the camp, His Royal Highness won't. On the contrary, he will only encourage everyone to practice and master their abilities as much as possible. My ability will bring trouble to the sisters, Mystery Moon whispered. You still have to practice, Vendi said resolutely. It's related to our life and death. Life and death? Leaf couldn't help but ask. Yes, His Royal Highness Roland found a way for us witches to safely pass the Day of Awakening. Nightingale took over from Vendi. From now on, we can say goodbye to the pain of magic bite, and all sisters can live smoothly until adulthood. All the witches widened their eyes and looked at Nightingale. For a moment, they couldn't believe their ears. Scroll asked in surprise, is it the Miss Anna you mentioned last time? But you said at the time that you didn't know the specific reason. Yes, at that time it was only His Highness' guess, but later on Nana's Day of Awakening confirmed this. She was also not harmed in any way. Then this method is... Scroll couldn't help but hold her breath. As long as I consume magic power every day, Nightingale said word by word, I can see the changes in magic power in the fog. Regular use of it would increase the total capacity of the body, and at the same time, the pain of body devouring would be reduced. When it's close to the Day of Awakening, as long as all the magic power is consumed, it will hardly cause any harm to the body. I think everyone can faintly feel it too, Vendi added. During the days when we were being hunted by the church, we felt that we were being hunted down. We carefully hid in the corners of the town, not daring to use our abilities. As a result, many sisters left us every winter. But this year, in the camp of the impassable mountain range, except for Ainan and Ike, Everyone survived the months of demons. So that's how it is. Leaf took a deep breath. This was the demonic bite that she had encountered in the barbarian land. The reason why the duration was so short. In other words, the holy mountain is not in that uninhabited place. Yes, the holy mountain is not a specific place, Vendi nodded. As long as it accepts us, doesn't regard witches as demons, and doesn't restrict us from using our abilities, it is the holy mountain. Vendi also made a request to His Highness Roland. She wanted to go back to the camp after the months of demons and tell everyone this news. Nightingale looked at Vendi and said softly, even if you don't find the holy mountain, you can still live well in the mountains. Since everyone is back, there is no need to mention this. Vendi smiled and shook her head. So, whether His Highness needs your ability or not, for your own safety, you have to practice it every day. If this is the key to resolving the magic bite, will there be other witches who have already noticed it? Scroll thought for a moment and said, we are not the first witch organization to gather together. In the Kingdom of Dawn and the Kingdom of Wolfheart, there are other witch associations. I have sent letters to them, wanting to invite them to search for the Holy Mountain together, but I have never received a reply. Leaf sighed softly. She knew that Scroll still had something to say. Since Kara found the ancient book in an underground ruin in the eastern forest, she had firmly led everyone on the road to find the Holy Mountain. At this point, the Witch Cooperation Association began a long journey of exile, almost through the entire Grey Castle. Along the way, everyone met many new sisters, but also lost a lot of sisters. If they had chosen to hide in the ruins from the beginning, would they have found this key in advance? We can try to contact the witches hidden in other cities, Nightingale said. His Highness Roland also has this plan. He wants to release rumors to make the witches pay attention to this remote town. If we can act as a middleman, there is no doubt that it will greatly reduce their vigilance. But I still don't understand in the end, why did His Highness take us in? Echo was at a loss. This foreign woman from the southernmost region had a much worse experience than most witches. She was first sold by the Sand Nation to a merchant in the port of Clearwater, and then later resold all the way to King City. She was forced to learn dancing and court etiquette, and even skills to please men. If she hadn't happened to be rescued by the Witch Cooperation Association, she would have been sold at a high price to a duke or a minister. Until now, when she spoke, she still had a distinct foreign accent. Maybe he's just like those people who want to buy you. Lily curled her lips. Men. Don't talk nonsense, Lily, Nightingale said in a displeased tone. His Highness Roland is different from those people. As long as we live here for a while, we will naturally understand. That's right, I have a deep understanding of this. Vendi still had a gentle smile on her face. It's already late, everyone should go back to their rooms and sleep. Even if your ability doesn't work, you don't need to worry. His Highness said that he wants the witches in his territory to be able to live a normal life. If you want to know what His Highness will have you do tomorrow, she deliberately paused, I think he will probably start by filling out a contract. Leaf and Scroll returned to their room, the latter closed the door. We should also sleep. When she had asked about her ability, His Highness had arranged for her and Scroll to stay in the same room, but also said that this was only a temporary arrangement. Later on Border Town would provide a new single room. But in her opinion, sleeping 3 people in such a spacious bed would not be a problem. She took off her coat and crawled into the quilt. An indescribable softness and comfort suddenly wrapped her whole body. Leaf couldn't help but let out a soft moan, burying her head in the pillow. After a long time, she softly asked, Do you blame Kara? Scroll sighed. No one can predict the future, no matter what she did later. At least at the beginning she sincerely wanted to find a home where witches could live in peace. Now it's meaningless to mention this. Sleep, child. Chapter 100. Just as Vendi had said, the next morning, the witches were called to the first floor by the maids. After breakfast, the prince handed each of them a piece of fine parchment. Considering that some of the witches couldn't read the words, Scroll repeated the contents to everyone. Then they signed and pressed their fingerprints. Roland knew that it was difficult for them to really understand the meaning of each line of the contract, but it didn't matter, they would eventually understand. He also knew that even if it was a contract of slavery, they would still sign their names at this moment. Roland didn't feel that providing a relatively generous contract was an act that would make him suffer a loss. Since he had chosen to walk this path, he had to look further. What he was doing now was to form a good cycle in the future, a win-win framework that could be implemented in the long run. After putting away the contract, Roland arranged everyone's training tasks according to the plan he had drawn up last night, and then called Leaf, Scroll and Soroya to follow him back to the office. After closing the door, Nightingale appeared and winked at her sisters. "I've been thinking about what Vendi told me yesterday." Roland opened the curtains, letting the bright sunshine into the room. "She said that you encountered a terrible monster, and in the end, only 7 of you survived. Even the mentor of the Witch Cooperation Association, Kara, died in the barbarian land. I want to know, in the end, what did you encounter? A hybrid demonic beast?" Leaf was the first to speak. "It wasn't a demonic beast, they were demons from the gates of hell. They had a tall body, could control demonic beasts, and also had magic, just like..." She hesitated. "Just like us? Demons?" Roland frowned and looked at Soroya. "Were you there at the time?" The latter nodded. "You can draw the scene at that time, right?" Roland handed over a piece of paper. Soroya closed her eyes, looking a little pained, but she still took the paper. She walked to the table. As she used her ability, a faintly discernible quill appeared in her hand. The tip of the quill glowed with a colorful light. Then, it flew out of her hand and started writing on the paper. A vivid picture gradually appeared on the paper, but Soroya never opened her eyes. Roland moved closer to the table. The picture on the paper was extremely realistic. No, he told himself, it was not a picture, but a real-time recording of the scene at that time. Her ability was like a video camera, replaying the massacre in the wildlands from a first-person perspective. When she finished painting, Soroya's forehead was covered with sweat. Obviously, this memory was like a nightmare to her. Nightingale poked her head over and asked, "Is this a demon?" "That's them." Leaf pointed to the one closest to her. "This demon is wearing metal gloves. He can summon lightning to attack. He's also very strong." More than a dozen sisters died in his hands. The devil in the distance could throw a spear several times faster than a crossbow bolt. However, their special attacks could not be used continuously. "I took this opportunity to kill them." "You alone?" Roland asked. "The leather tube under the demonic beast's helmet is the devil's weakness." Leaf pointed to the iron devil's neck. "Kara's magic snake bit off his tube and eventually died together with him. I used the same method to kill the other one with a crossbow. The tube seemed to store some red gas. When the gas leaked out, they died. Well, this thing looked like an oxygen tank no matter how he looked at it. How could there be such a creature in the wasteland?" Roland was puzzled. But to say that they were aliens was obviously not at that level. Looking at the leather tube full of patches and the clothes made of animal skin, it could only be said that the level of civilization was comparable to that of his own. Whether it was through technology or magic, the fact that they could take the initiative to go to other planets showed their strength. The Earthlings even had to stagger to land on the moon. Of course, he couldn't rule out some strange civilizations with crooked talents. Roland thought, in short, the devils were not invincible enemies, they could also be killed. "In addition to the devils, we also saw a floating city," said Leaf. "No matter how far we went, it was still in front of us. Lightning once mentioned in her adventure story that it seemed to be a mirage." "Can you draw it?" Roland asked Soroya. She nodded, summoned the magic pen again, and drew the floating city that Leaf had mentioned on the paper. Roland carefully looked at the picture, but there was not much information in the blurred picture. If the city was really a mirage, then at least it meant that the real body was somewhere in the wasteland. And the blood mist over the city was the gas that the devils breathed. This explanation was much more reliable than what the aliens had said. After all, the vast continent west of the impassable mountain range was a mysterious area that no one had ever set foot in, so it was not surprising that other races existed. Now there was only one question left. "I heard Nightingale and Vendi mention that Kara decided to look for the Holy Mountain because of an ancient book," Roland asked. "Scroll, have you read that book?" Scroll hesitated for a moment. "Kara didn't allow anyone to read that book, but I've peeked at it." The words recorded in it are messy and incredible. Can you make a copy of it? Let me see. That's not true, Your Highness. The non-existence of the holy mountain has proved this. She sighed and raised her right hand. I hope you won't be fooled by the contents of the book. A gold-rimmed book appeared in the air. The cover opened to both sides, the pages flipped quickly, and then with a bang, it closed and fell into her hand. Your Highness, I hope that you are the only one who reads it. I don't want to see other sisters become like Kara. Roland took the book. I know. After the witches left the office, Nightingale quietly appeared beside the sofa. As usual, she lifted her robe, put her feet on the low table, and chewed dried fish slices. Don't you want to come and see? Roland asked with a smile. Nightingale snorted disdainfully. I'm not interested in the things that lunatics like to read. He shook his head, sat back at the table, and carefully turned the pages, as if the book really had magic. As Scroll had said, most of the content was difficult to understand, and it seemed that the language and grammar were not the current way of writing. The text mentioned the bloody moon and the huge stone gate, but he didn't see the two words, Holy Mountain. In fact, except for a few words that he could occasionally understand, the rest of the content was basically unreadable. To sum it up, I know every word, but I can't understand them at all. He didn't know if it was because Scroll was panicking and piqued, which caused the content to be missing, or if the book itself was like this. Roland skipped those lengthy paragraphs and directly flipped to the back. It was a rather thick book, and only the first few pages had content, the rest were all blank. From the last page onwards, the handwriting suddenly changed. The previous neat handwriting became sloppy, as if it had been hastily jotted down, but the content was clear and easy to understand. Chapter 101. What does it mean? Roland stroked the line of words. Did the owner of the ancient book fight with the monsters in the barbarian land? He moved his gaze downwards. There are more and more demons, and fewer of us. Even the god's stone of retaliation cannot stop their attack. Just by relying on their unparalleled strength, even without relying on magic power, they would still be ferocious and terrifying enemies. The holy city of Tequila has fallen, and we have fled in all directions. Over the mountains, across the rivers, run as far as you can from the gates of hell. But next time, where can we escape to? But this is not something I need to think about. I am dying, Natalia. The power of the demons is corroding me, and no medicine will work. I'm writing all this because I have a favor to ask of you. Alice's experiment with the God's Punishment Army is coming to an end. The experiment was very successful, and the extraordinary warriors are not inferior to the demons. But she forgot that even if the God's Punishment Army wins, the victory will not belong to us. Yes, the God's Punishment Army will only bring destruction to us. Go and stop her. Only you can do it. This passage was not long. After reading it from beginning to end, Roland closed his eyes and tried to put himself in Kara's point of view. If she did not know the existence of the demons and replaced the demons with witches, she could easily imagine the church's army retreating under the attack of the witches. Then combined with the widespread rumors that witches were the minions of the demons, and that their magic came from the gates of hell, Kara was very likely to think that the church actually wanted to hide the truth. The so-called gates of hell were the entrance to the holy mountain. For hundreds of years, witches had gone to the holy mountain and obtained eternal life there. So there were more and more witches, and the church's soldiers were getting fewer and fewer. Of course, there were many loopholes in this speculation. For example, the notes mentioned that the demons had extraordinary strength, which was obviously not a characteristic of witches. Another example was that witches could defeat the church's army under the influence of the god's stone of retaliation, which seemed too bizarre. So what made Kara decide to go to the barbarian land, he still did not know. Was it her excessive eagerness that affected her judgment? Or was there a part of the content that he did not peek at, and that was the real reason? Roland was leaning towards the latter. At least now he knew that the demons described on the last page of the scribbled notes were not witches, but real otherworldlings. However, this did not reduce his doubts at all. Instead, it increased the number of unknown problems. When had the church ever fought with the demons? Roland flipped through the fourth prince's pitiful knowledge of mysticism. He couldn't find any related content. Ever since the end of the War of Faith, the church had established its base camp in the north to resist the demonic beasts that invaded the mainland from the Big Breach. Later, they simply built a magnificent fortress city on the Hermes Plateau and called it the New Holy City. These two connected cities, one high and one low, were used to fight against demonic beasts. Not the devil. Besides, he had never heard of the name Tequila. If these things were true, the church had no reason to hide it. In the books that recorded the history of the church, every successful defense against demonic beasts and major victory against witches would be described in detail, as if they were afraid that others would not know of their achievements. But fighting against the demons was more worthy of being written about than fighting against demonic beasts and witches. The last question was about the God's Punishment Army. Obviously, this member of the church did not want to see the God's Punishment Army appear and entrusted others to stop the person in charge of the experiment. It seemed that it was successful. Roland only knew that the church had the army of judges. But he had never heard of the God's Punishment Army. Of course, he could not rule out the fact that the fourth prince was ignorant. However, if they could really cultivate powerful warriors that could fight against the demons, it would only increase the strength of the church. Why did the author of the notebook think that the God's Punishment Army would bring destruction? What Scroll thought was inconceivable should be the latter 2 points. Do you know where you got the ancient book that led Kara astray? Roland looked up at Nightingale. When I joined the Witch Cooperation Association, my sisters had already set foot on the road to find the mountain. Nightingale chewed on dried fish and said in a vague voice, but Vendy once mentioned that the Witch Cooperation Association was not originally called the Witch Cooperation Association. It was just a group of witches from Seawinshire, including Kara, Vendy, and Scroll. Later, they found a hidden place in the forest not far from Seawinshire and used it as a secret meeting place. I didn't expect that it was actually the entrance to an underground ruin. She swallowed the snack in her mouth and licked her lips, but except for Kara, no one went down to explore. Was the ancient book found in the ruins? Anyway, that's what Kara claimed. Nightingale curled her lips. Later, there were more and more witches gathered. Maybe someone accidentally leaked their whereabouts during a meeting, so the church sent a large group of judges to surround the forest. More than 20 witches escaped, less than half of them. From then on, Kara decided to go to the impassable mountain range to find the Holy Mountain. So they called themselves the Witch Cooperation Association and set finding the Holy Mountain as the highest goal of their members. After listening to this, Roland fell into deep thought. Adding 2 little mystic points was so troublesome. Anything related to history and legends, his mind was basically a blank. The ancient book didn't mention the specific year, so he didn't know if other history books had any records of this war. The first person involved was already dead. If only I could go to the ruins to explore it, he thought. But Roland also knew that this was basically impossible to achieve. The eastern forest was too far away from him. Compared to a trip across the entire Grey Castle, developing his territory was his top priority. Walking to the window, Roland looked through the floor-to-ceiling window at the garden under his feet. The witches were training their abilities according to his orders. Now that he had 12 witches under his command, it was time to establish an organization. In his mind, this organization didn't need any program or guidelines. It was set up to facilitate the management of witches and the reasonable use of their abilities. Its function was similar to the industry guilds in the future. The rules of the organization were as simple as possible, with only 2 rules. Don't use your abilities to violate the territory laws. Don't use your abilities to evade the law. Roland initially wanted to imitate the 3 laws of robotics and restrict the witches from using their abilities to harm or attack ordinary people, but later he felt that it was unnecessary. For them, abilities were just like guns in the hands of ordinary people. When they encountered danger, there was no essential difference between using a gun and using their abilities to fight back. Moreover, deliberately emphasizing the difference between witches and ordinary people would only make the gap between the 2 groups bigger and bigger. Therefore, not breaking the law and not evading responsibility was the most concise expression that a technical dog could think of. As for the name of the organization, Roland had already thought about it. Chapter 102. At night, the mansion of the Elk family was brightly lit. When Perrault, who held the invitation, was ushered into the hall by the attendants, the birthday banquet for Aurelia, the third daughter of the Elk family, had just begun. Those who were able to participate in the banquet were all nobles of Longsong's stronghold with a considerable family background and prestige. The Earl also attached great importance to this birthday banquet, which could be seen from the wool carpet that was spread all over the hall and the uniform of the attendants who were wearing black with gold edging. After all, Aurelia had just turned 16 years old and was at the age to talk about marriage. String music sounded, and attendants walked through the crowd with wine and wine glasses. Several round tables in the hall were filled with steaming hot cooked food. The protagonist, Aurelia, was dressed like a canary and was surrounded by a group of sisters in a corner of the hall. They seemed to be chatting happily. This was the most popular banquet style in King City. The previous banquets in the Western region were not like this, thought Perrault. Usually, people sat around a long wooden table and waited for the chef to serve the dishes. The dishes served were large bowls of pork and whole chicken, buttered bread, double-fried eggs, and large plates of lettuce. But for Perrault, who had also stayed in King City for several years, this birthday banquet was just an imitation. For example, the wine glasses in the hands of the attendants were all colored glasses, not transparent and clean glasses. After pouring wine into the glasses, they could not bring out the wine's own mellow color. The round table should be covered with white cloth instead of exposing the greasy surface. As for the cooked food, it still maintained the traditional style of the Western region, big and thick. Perrault shook his head. At least let the chef cut it into small pieces before serving it. According to the usual practice, he had already filled his stomach at home before coming to the banquet, so he would not cut these large pieces of cooked meat at this time. The invitees to the banquet all represented the faces of their families, and it would really damage their image if they ate here with their mouths glistening with grease. Perrault did not want to be treated as a joke in the mouths of the young ladies. "Long time no see, buddy." Suddenly, someone hooked his neck from behind. "I heard that you were appointed as an envoy by the Lord again? How was the ore harvest in Border Town? You must have taken a lot from there." This familiar voice belonged to Ren Med, the second son of the Elk family, a fool who only wanted to become a famous knight and didn't even care about his territory. Of course, he was also his friend. Not bad. Perrault didn't want to talk about his experience in Border Town. "Did you have any use in Coldwind Ridge this time? Or did you just stay in Hermes Tavern and shiver?" "Damn it." Ren pushed Perrault. "I've never heard you say anything nice. This time, I didn't even go to the new holy city. The day before the border guard set off, I caught a cold and was bedridden for a whole week." "Not bad. You've improved a little compared to last time. At least you've saved the guards a lot of trouble." "You're wrong this time." Ren suddenly smiled mysteriously. "If I hadn't been bedridden for a week in Coldwind Ridge, I'm afraid I would have been lying on the cold walls of the holy city forever." "What do you mean?" Perrault raised his eyebrows. "I also heard it from others." The second son of the Elk family whispered in Roland's ear. "The new holy city almost fell and the demonic beasts rushed into the inner city. If the church hadn't sent their strongest warriors, I'm afraid they wouldn't have been able to protect the holy city cathedral. However, the armies of the four kingdoms suffered heavy losses. Only a few people from Coldwind Ridge came back. In just 1 month, the whole city was full of widows. Those who don't usually have savings." He blinked and stretched out 2 fingers. 2 silver royals is enough." "Hey, don't look at me like that. I didn't do anything." "Are you sure this news is true? What about the border guards?" "Of course, I saw it with my own eyes. The Lord fell ill the same day he received the news." Ren shrugged. "As for the guards, what else can we do? We can only slowly recruit them. Right now, the northern region is in urgent need of experienced warriors. If my family didn't call me back, I could at least lead a cavalry team." This is not the point, Perrault thought. The main defense of the border guards in Coldwind Ridge was the church's army of judges. Now the generals and warriors of the four kingdoms were buried in Hermes. No matter how you look at it, it smells like a conspiracy. If they were plotting something, the north of Grey Castle was now like a naked woman. What about the army of judges? What are their losses? Not much better than the armies of the Four Kingdoms. If you think about it, they are always the fanatics who rush to the front. Then again, if the army of judges doesn't go to the front, the troops of the other countries will certainly not move. He said disdainfully. Those knights are all like this. They talk about honor, but when it comes to fighting against the demonic beasts, they like to hide in the back. For example, the one in front of me. Perrault smiled. Maybe I'm thinking too much. But even if the church wants to attack the north, it has nothing to do with Long Song's stronghold. Let the new king worry about this. Unfortunately, no one has accepted my allegiance, or rather, I haven't found anyone who is qualified. Ren paused and looked towards the door. The people of the wolf family are coming. I'll go greet them first. I'll come back later to find you. Go, don't come back. By the way, Roland had only walked 2 steps when he turned back. Did you notice the handkerchief in the invitation? Did you put it there? Oh, I'll only give you a pair of socks that have been worn for 2 days. He shook his finger. My sister cut them herself. Although the age gap between you is a bit big, but as long as you have the intention, I will certainly support you both. Don't delay it anymore, my friend. You are already 22 years old. Perrault gave him a supercilious look. The latter whistled and walked away with a smile. Taking a glass of wine from the waiter's plate, Perrault walked alone to the corner, quietly looking at the lively hall. He noticed that while Aurelia was chatting happily with her sisters, she would steal glances at him from time to time. Just a moment ago, when their eyes met, he could see the other's quickly moving line of sight and her cheeks showing a touch of embarrassment. Perrault returned a polite smile. But in his eyes, the other was just a little girl. Suddenly, a fierce discussion broke out on the side of the hall, attracting everyone's attention. What? He really dared to say that? Yes, that coward Cornelius. He didn't even dare to fart and came back with his tail between his legs. The man with the loudest voice said, "He's simply a disgrace to Long Song's stronghold." Perrault knew him. He seemed to be called Simon Airy, a branch of the wolf family. He had married a rather beautiful woman. He had also seen that woman, and she was indeed charming. You speak as if you have a way to solve it. Someone sneered. I may not be able to do it alone, but if His Excellency the Duke pays attention to this absurd matter, I don't believe that Roland Wimbledon would dare to act so recklessly. Chapter 103. Perrault leaned towards the crowd. What happened? He asked. Sir Hull, someone saw the honeysuckle emblem on his chest. We are talking about the Lord of Border Town. He confiscated the property of the nobles in Long Song's stronghold. Call me Perrault. What is the specific situation? I will explain it to Mr. Perrault. Simon squeezed his way forward, showing a flattering smile. It is like this. Under the orders of the Duke, we usually live in Border Town and manage the North Slope mine for the Lord. Every winter we will bring the townspeople back to Long Song's stronghold to protect them from the demonic beasts. At the end of this year's Months of the Demons, one of my colleagues, Cornelius of the Fletcher family, was unexpectedly told by the Lord of Border Town that his house had been demolished by the townspeople without any compensation. Either you admit that the house doesn't belong to you, or you will be sent to prison and hanged for desertion. He imitated the words of the fourth Prince Roland. Sir, what is called desertion? This is what every mine manager has done for hundreds of years. Perrault's mind could not help but recall the appearance of the young gray-haired man. Although the outside world said that the prince was extremely unbearable, but from his 2 personal experiences with him, he knew that Roland Wimbledon was by no means an ordinary person. And in this way of dealing with the crime of desertion, it was just an excuse that the other side casually found. The prince had never thought of using reason to convince these people. He has completely broken off relations with Long Song's stronghold, Perrault thought, or to think deeper, does the prince not know that every year the townspeople and nobles go to Long Song's stronghold to take refuge? Obviously not. He clearly knows, but he still imposed a crime, forced the other side to make a choice, and even let the other side send such a barbaric result back to Long Song's stronghold. In the end, what does the prince want to do? But he is the Lord of Border Town. said the man who had previously laughed at Simon. "The Lord has the right to rule the laws of his territory. Border Town is also under the jurisdiction of the Western Territory." Simon said coldly, displeased. "Do you question Lord Ryan's authority? Being stationed in the small town to supervise the work in the mine was the Lord's idea. Now that Roland has occupied all the houses of the nobles, he is openly opposing the 6 great families. Lord Lionheart will not sit idly by." "Are you talking about the executioner who hanged Hills Med and didn't even give him a letter? Ren came over at some point in time. My father was furious with Thunder because of this." "Lord Med," said Simeon, saluting, "it is this man. Now that he's acting even more wildly, I'm afraid only His Excellency the Duke can stop him. I hope you can convey this message to us." "Don't worry. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. Lord Ryan is prepared to deal with him." Ren said indifferently, "I came back for this. My brother is negotiating a trade deal in King City. I'm the only one who can lead the Elk family." "Really? That's wonderful," said Simon joyfully. Perrault frowned. Although he knew that since the winter letter was sent, His Royal Highness the Prince had chosen to stay in Border Town, sooner or later there would be such a day. But he had never thought that his friend would also have to put on his armor and go into battle. Ignoring the strange eyes of the crowd, he directly pulled Ren to the side and dissuaded him. "Don't go, that's the prince." "I know he's the prince of the mountains," Ren Med patted Perrault's shoulder. "Don't worry, Lord Ryan won't hurt a prince. Maybe as soon as we get there, he'll directly surrender. Even if he wants to resist, as long as we get on our horses, wouldn't all the farmers and miners run away? The 4th prince doesn't know how to wield a sword or a gun. I don't think he'll be able to hurt even a hair." "No, I'm worried that you'll be hurt by him." Perrault opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. He knew that the other side wouldn't believe him, because even he himself found it hard to believe that the prince could rely on those miners to defeat the Duke's coalition. But he didn't know why, but he always felt a little uneasy. "Young Master Perrault, your father wants you to go back. He has something important to talk to you about." A white-haired steward suddenly rushed to Perrault's side and whispered in his ear. "I know." Perrault nodded, and after saying goodbye to Ren in advance, he sat in the carriage with the steward and returned to Count Honeysuckle's mansion. "Father." He walked into the study, where Shalafi Hull was writing something on the table. Hearing Perrault's voice, the Count didn't stop writing. "You go and summarize the output of the territory, the number of people, and the income separately, and give them to me. I'll arrange the spring expedition. The Duke Ryan's conscription order has already been issued. After the snow melts, our 5 families will provide knight and mercenaries for him to go to Border Town." "How much?" The Count's hand slightly paused, and he raised his head. "What's wrong? You've never cared about this kind of problem before." He opened the letter on the table. "The knight will have at least 25 people, as well as the corresponding squires and horses. The mercenaries will have 40 people, and they must be fully armed. If there are more than 100 freedmen or serfs, they should be equipped with simple weapons." Perrault calculated in his heart, so the 5 families added up to about 1,000 people, plus the Duke's own troops. It could already be regarded as a force that could sweep through the western region. Even if Long Song's stronghold didn't turn out in full force, this team was still not something that Border Town could resist. There were only a total of more than 2,000 people there. "Father, can you not go to the battlefield?" He hesitated but still opened his mouth. "What's wrong, son?" the Count asked strangely. "I'm worried about your safety." Shalafi couldn't help but laugh. "Do you know what you're saying? An elephant trampling an ant to death? What kind of danger can there be? His Royal Highness only has a few knights and less than 50 personal guards, but we have 10 times as many people as he does." In theory, this was indeed the case. Before he had seen His Royal Highness, Perrault would also think so. "Father, everyone says that the walls made of mud will collapse when it rains, but His Royal Highness presided over the construction of the walls. They also say that it is impossible to stop the demonic beasts by relying only on the miners of Border Town, but His Royal Highness not only achieved this, even after the end of the months of the demons, no one escaped back to Long Song's stronghold." The more he said, the more uneasy he became. Now, Everyone thinks that the Duke's victory over Roland Wimbledon was nothing more than an elephant running over an ant. Father, will the result really be like this? Enough. Shalafi slammed the table. He shook his head, stood up, and went to the wall where the portraits of the ancestors were hung. Compared to fighting on horseback, you prefer to do business and talk about business, which is normal. But being a businessman doesn't mean being timid. Those merchants who sail across the ocean face the threat of death every day. He knocked on the wall and said loudly, "Look at this. Your grandfather, your grandfather's grandfather, they all relied on swords and longbows to gain a foothold in this place full of beasts, refugees, and bandits. You are so afraid of fighting, it really disappoints me." Chapter 104. On a sunny afternoon, Roland fulfilled his promise. He conferred the title of Viscount to Sir Pine. His territory was divided to the south of the Redwater River, across the river from Border Town. Today, it was still a dense forest, belonging to the undeveloped area. In order to make him give up the autonomy of his territory, Roland promised to give priority to the development of Sir Pine's territory. He also promised to give some shares to the Viscount and his descendants. Of course, Roland used his verbal skills to describe it as a good thing that he didn't need to manage his own property, and could just lie down and share the money. Sir Pine readily agreed. He didn't like these things. In his opinion, there was nothing more interesting than fighting on horseback. But now that he had a daughter, he put all his energy into hunting. In addition, Sir Pine's original territory had long been in decline, so he simply asked the prince to send someone to help him sell the land east of Longsong Stronghold and move his whole family to Border Town. Roland naturally agreed. The other person was Brian. Roland granted him the status of a knight, and asked him whether he wanted to choose the land or to serve in the army. If he chose the land, he couldn't join the First Army in Border Town. If he joined the army, he would have to rely on his military achievements to be promoted and get rewarded land. Brian didn't hesitate to choose the latter. In this way, Roland had a general layout of the land use plan. The land between the Redwater River and the impassable mountain range was the residential area. The narrowest part was about 3 kilometers, and the widest part was about 7 or 8 kilometers. In the future, it could be used to build a community, or it could be used as a reward for promoted officers. On the other side of the Redwater River was the future industrial and agricultural area. The land could be extended to the south, but at present it was still a forest, and in the distance there were undulating hills. When the population met the demand, Roland would inevitably start to reclaim the forest. The concealing forest to the west of Border Town was also an important development point. There were all kinds of treasures in the forest, such as wood, edible fungi, wild animals, and medicinal herbs. In addition to being used for construction and industry, wood could also be used as fuel. The area of this forest was astonishingly large. Roland had asked Lightning to explore it, and even after flying for 30 kilometers, they still couldn't see the end of it. Even if they used all of it as firewood, it would still burn for a long time. Finally, there was the open space between the concealing forest and the impassable mountain range. It was also a forbidden area that no one had ever set foot in, the Savage Land. Based on the direction of the mountain range and the forest, the land in between was extremely vast, almost larger than the kingdom of Grey Castle. Faced with such an unclaimed land, Roland's heart itched. But he also knew that he couldn't care about this place for the time being. At present, what Border Town needed the most was population. Returning to his office in the castle, he summoned the artist Soroya. "How's the work with City Hall going? I've never painted so many pictures in one day." She looked much more energetic than when they first met. "I've basically finished painting by today. But when I paint, I only leave a window the size of a head, which feels a little strange." In order to avoid scaring the townspeople with your magic pen, the prince smiled. Although they know that witches exist, such close contact is still easy to cause accidents, so we simply take some hidden means so that they don't know that you're a witch. In the future it will slowly get better. Soroya's photographic ability brought a new upgrade to Roland's citizen registration plan. For this plan, City Hall vacated a room as an archive, which was used to store the information of the townspeople. Similar to the household register, each piece of paper had their name, age, residence, blood relationship, and other information. Barav had made a simple count of this information during the winter, and this time, the records had been expanded by a lot. The biggest change was that all the people's household registers were attached with color photos. According to Roland's request, City Hall had set up a small room in the hall for a single person to enter and exit. The room was wrapped in linen, leaving only a square window in front of it, so that Soroya could see the other person's appearance. This way, when the witch painted the portrait inside the room, the other person wouldn't see the magical pen. As for how to make the residents of the territory actively come to report their information, Roland's method was very simple. Every person who came would receive a subsidy of 10 copper royals. This money would be allocated by City Hall. Today, I called you here because I want you to draw something else. Roland spread out the cut paper in front of Soroya. The latter noticed that the size of the paper was exactly the same, only half the size of a palm, in a rectangular shape. What do you want me to draw? Some props for entertainment, Roland said. This idea had already existed in his mind for a long time. Besides practicing every day, the witches basically had nothing to do, so this kind of life seemed a bit boring. It was the same for the prince, especially when he was waiting for the snow to melt. His range of activities was basically limited to the castle. Therefore, it was imperative to find some entertainment activities and find a few witches to accompany him to relax his mood. The easiest one was naturally playing cards. However, the soft ordinary paper was not suitable to be used in the hands, and shuffling the cards was also troublesome. Now that he had Soroya, he could naturally consider making some more advanced things. Entertainment? She tilted her head and thought. It seemed that she didn't understand what kind of entertainment drawing on a square piece of paper was. Well, you have the final say. First, you draw a soldier holding a heavy crossbow on this piece of paper. Imagine. Yes, his armor, body, age, as well as the environment, all of it is up to you to imagine. As long as he is holding a heavy crossbow. I'll try. Soroya closed her eyes and thought for a moment, then a colorful magic pen appeared in her hand. Soon, a middle-aged man who looked like a crossbowman jumped on the paper. Very good, Roland praised. Let me think about what to draw next. In the upper left corner and the middle of the paper, draw a small circle. He recalled the appearance of the cards in his mind. The first circle should be white with gold edges, and the second circle should be orange with gold edges. After these drawings were finished, Roland asked her to add a number to the first circle, and add a bow and arrow symbol to the second circle. The magical thing about Soroya's ability was that she could draw regardless of the material, so there was no difference between a blank piece of paper and a piece of paper with a pattern. The pattern drawn on the latter could perfectly cover the former, just like a layer of cover. Thus, a delicate crossbowman card appeared in front of Roland. Is this good? She asked. This is just a unit card. There are still many similar cards to draw, and in the end, we can make a deck of cards. Then I'll teach you how to play. Looking at the way Soroya drew with her eyes closed, Roland had a premonition that perhaps this kind of dialogue would soon fill his castle. Chapter 105. Echo was sitting at the top of the castle, on the roof of the watchtower, from where she could see the whole town. She had asked Lightning to take her up, and when the sun went down, the little girl would come back to send her down. Now, Lightning should be on the way to Longsong Stronghold. Today's weather was very good, the sun shone brightly on the earth, and the distant river was like a shining silk, slowly flowing west, dividing the green leaves and snow into two parts. Lying in the sun, she felt that her whole body was surrounded by a soft warmth, unlike the scorching sun in the southernmost region, where the hot light easily hurt her skin. The wind was also very different, she thought. There were many kinds of wind in the mainland kingdom. There was the slightly salty sea breeze in the port of Clearwater. There was the hot and humid monsoon wind in King City. There was the bone-chilling north wind in the impassable mountain range. And now there was the breeze with the fragrance of the earth in Border Town. In any case, the wind here was pure and single. But in Iron Sand City, it was either hot and windless, or overwhelming storms. The wind was visible. The whistling airflow was mixed with pebbles and gravel, like a giant black beast sweeping over. At this time, it was necessary to hide in a house, or any place that could avoid the wind. Standing against the wind would only lead to death. Echo gently exhaled. Now that she thought about it, it had been nearly 4 years since she left Iron Sand City. Osha clan was unfortunately defeated in the struggle for power, and after her father surrendered, he was still killed by the enemy. She had witnessed all this and wanted to rush up and die together with the enemy, but she was hit from behind. She didn't know how many people in the clan were still alive after 4 years. Before she was sold as a slave to the port of Clearwater, she had heard that the Osha clan had violated the agreement of the Holy Duel, and that the clansmen who were spurned by the 3 gods would be banished to the Endless Cape, never to return to the Iron Sand City. But Echo knew that all of this was a conspiracy of the Iron Whip clan. They smeared the whip with black oil that flowed from the ground, and once it was ignited, even water couldn't extinguish it. It was this trick that caused her brother, the strongest warrior in the clan, to be burned alive during the duel, leading to chaos in the team formation. Other than the boiling yellow sand in the Endless Cape, there was only the eternal pillar of fire and the ocean that was even more violent than Mother Earth. The people of the Sand Nation who went there would soon turn into bones, and their fates would be even more miserable than those who had become slaves. After Echo awakened as an oracle, she was also known as a witch in the mainland kingdom. She had also thought of revenge, but her ability was useless in simulating voices. No matter how much she begged the 3 gods, the gods did not give her a decree. After living in the port of Clearwater for half a year, she came to understand that the god's envoy was favored by the 3 gods, but it was just a lie that the Majins used to deceive themselves. Within the jurisdiction of the 4 kingdoms, the oracles were all targets of the church. From that day onwards, Huiying had completely given up all hope of revenge. At this moment, thick smoke suddenly rose in the distance. She looked towards the east bank of the Redwater River, only to see a flickering green flame passing through the woods. The black smoke from the burning trees and the white mist from the evaporation of the snow mixed together, forming a gray column of smoke on the horizon. It was Anna's green flames. When they first arrived here, Vendi briefly introduced Anna and Nana to her sisters. At that time, Echo was very envious of Anna's ability. Freely manipulating flames, a high temperature that could melt swords. If she had such a strong power when she was in the Iron Sand City, no one in the Iron Whip clan would have survived. Echo shook her head. Now it was meaningless to think about these things. Compared to her clansmen who were likely to be buried in the yellow sand, she was still alive and lucky. Since His Royal Highness was willing to accept her, then all she could do was to work hard to complete His Royal Highness's orders. She cleared her throat and began to hum a song according to His Royal Highness's request. It was a cheerful song. His Royal Highness had only hummed it once, but she had completely remembered the whole tune. Music was no stranger to Echo. When she was taught as a superior slave, she had to master the skills of seductive dancing and provocative singing. But His Royal Highness's song was completely different. It was very rhythmic, full of a burst of vitality, especially when he asked her to imitate the sound of a flute to play this piece of music. Every note seemed to be beating, making people unable to help but want to dance with it. The difficulty was to add drums and strings while the song was progressing. It was the first time for Echo to simulate 3 kinds of sounds at the same time and to overlap them. She had never thought that music could be played like this. At first, it was difficult for her to ensure that the drums would not disrupt the rhythm of the flute, so she tried to follow His Royal Highness's suggestion, using her hands or feet to beat the beat, gradually fusing the 2 kinds of sounds together. After a few days of practice, Echo gradually mastered this method of imitation. After trying it out a few times, she stood up and decided to add the last string music. As the music played, Echo found that the minor had changed again. If the cheerful flute formed its body, and the impassioned drums gave it its bones, then the string music at the end, which seemed to be embellished, gave the song a soul. We are all sharpshooters. Every bullet destroys an enemy. We are all flying soldiers, even if the mountains are high and the rivers are deep. In the dense woods, everywhere we arrange our comrades' camps. On the high hills, with our countless brothers. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.